It was a warm, cloudy, early autumn afternoon 15 years ago when I began my first ever playthrough of the DualShock Director's Cut of Resident Evil, and it would be on a cold, icy Friday night in late January the following year when I would finish it. The entire journey through that game from beginning to end made it one of my all-time favorite games. Since then, I have played through the game a couple of other times, but they were playthroughs of different versions of it, including the HD remake and the port for the Sega Saturn. And with Capcom essentially shadow dropping the original PS1 trilogy of Resident Evil on Steam, I thought it would be a great time to revisit this game and its different variations to see just how much these different versions of the game deviate from the original, if for no other reason than to satiate my own curiosity. For the sake of transparency, I will be capturing the PS1 footage of both the original and DX versions from my PlayStation 3. I will be capturing footage of the Sega Saturn version off the Sega Saturn, the GameCube version of the remake captured from my Wii, and since I don't have the means to capture clear DS footage, I'm using footage uploaded by Longplay Archives, the link to which I will add in the description. For this video, I played through each version of the game as both Jill and Chris and finished their campaigns, pursuing a variety of endings across all platforms, and doing so for each gameplay option available. For example, for the first Resident Evil on the PlayStation, I played the DX edition, meaning that I played through the game as both Chris and Jill on original, beginner, and arranged modes, and on the DS I played through their respective stories again on both classic and ReBirth mode, as well as Master of Knifing. Needless to say, I played a lot of Resident Evil, and now I'm ready to talk about it. So, without further ado, let's get started. My original interpretation of the first Resident Evil was that it was kind of like one giant Zelda dungeon. While I can see what I meant by that, I do believe that there are some key design aspects of Resident Evil that make that description inadequate for me. This is thanks mostly to the fact that how you interact with the game changes on repeat playthroughs. The mansion, its courtyard, guardhouse, caves, and laboratory all present their own elements of challenge that give the game its unique sense of being one giant escape room. The vast majority of the game is spent in the mansion. You are asked to explore the mansion from the start, checking various doors to see which ones you can enter and which ones you can't. Using the power of observation and interacting with objects in the background, you can find items or equipment that can be very useful to your survival, or even crucial for progression. Items of vital importance tend to have a shimmering effect applied to them to telegraph a point of interest to the player, although not all objects have this effect. Most of the time, the solutions to puzzles are revealed through environmental hints, character dialogue, interacting with background objects, or some combination of those things. For example, if a room is especially dark, it might be worthwhile to look for a light switch. Or if you encounter a locked door with an engraving of a shield on it, you might recall seeing a shield emblem elsewhere in the mansion, and there might be some association between it and the locked door. One of the interesting aspects of this game is the fact that some puzzles have more than one possible solution, and which solution you find is wholly dependent on how you interact with the various environmental elements. An item found in one seemingly nondescript room in the mansion might turn out to be of extreme importance in the guardhouse or laboratory later on, or getting a specific ending. Although these are quite small details, retrieval of these objects can tend to carry a butterfly effect, since these small actions can influence the game's ending in a major way. This is one of the major sources of replay value for Resident Evil. Everyone knows that one of the other key elements of Resident Evil is its emphasis on resource management. Your character has a limited number of inventory slots, which are used by everything you choose to pick up except for plot-sensitive documents that you can find around the mansion, which can be added to your file. This includes your weapons and any extra ammo you choose to bring along with you. The game has a finite amount of ammo you can find, and that, in combination with the fact that you are forced to balance your weapons and ammo with other important items necessary for healing or solving puzzles, it creates an incentive to pick your battles very carefully, and this is where the game's survival aspect comes from. Especially early in the game when you have only a combat knife, which takes a certain level of skill to wield effectively, and a handgun with 15 rounds, which deal little damage against zombies and Cerberus, which are early game enemies. You really have to carefully choose which enemies to engage and which to avoid. Naturally, you'll find yourself running around enemies a lot once you learn how to do so, even after you acquire more powerful weapons. Of course, it is entirely possible to go through the whole game with just the combat knife. While it does take a lot of practice to wield properly, once the skill to use it is cultivated properly, it does vastly simplify the item management and can cut significant time from your final completion time. Because of the item and weapon management system in place, you might find that on certain occasions, you treat your interactions with enemies on whether or not you engage in combat with them in strategic terms, rather than other games which might expect you to blast your way through them, showing no mercy. This also means having strategic movement around the mansion and memorization of where enemies will be at any given time and place in the game. Memorizing where enemies are located, what kinds of enemies are located there, and which enemies in which spots have already been taken out can be extremely helpful in streamlining navigation through the mansion, especially on future playthroughs. When it comes to gameplay, the controls are the part that loses most people. To reiterate, I played the Japanese version of the director's cut available on the PlayStation Store, which is not the DualShock edition. This means that for me, there was no analog control. But if my first ever playthrough of the game in 2011 on original hardware where I did have the analog option taught me anything, it was that the D-pad is my preferred way of movement in this game. The PlayStation controller's D-pad is perfect for this style of control, in contrast to the analog control, which I personally found to be a bit vague and disorienting. All that being said, how does controlling this game work? This is the main filter for Resident Evil, since all versions of this game have some iteration of this control layout, and most people who give up on the game typically do so because of how unorthodox this game controls in contrast to modern standardized control schemes. Up on the D-pad makes your character move forward, down makes them move backward, and left and right turns them left and right respectively. But moving your character is all reliant on their perspective rather than the player's perspective. That means if the character is facing the left edge of the screen, pressing up will make them move to the player's left. If the character is moving towards a player, pressing right on the D-pad turns them to the player's left, since that is the character's right. Even for me, it's confusing when I describe it that way. But if you just reprogram yourself to think about your control inputs relative to your character's perspective, it might become intuitive after a while. Of course, This is from a time when character movement in 3D space was still relatively new in the industry. But sometimes it can even be helpful to forget that this is a 3D game and just interpret it more as a 2D game with faux 3D elements, which, to be honest, isn't entirely that far off. You might have better luck if you struggle with movement in this game, if you think about it that way. Managing your inventory is as simple as opening the pause menu. Once there, you are able to select the different items you hold in your inventory, which you can either use or equip, examine, or combine. Not all of these actions can be taken with every possible item, but it becomes pretty clear later on which actions can be performed with which items. To use your weapons, you must hold down the R1 bumper and use the action button. The action buttons are mapped differently depending on your region. Since I'm speaking for the Japanese version, this is the square button. It's been a very long time since I played the North American version, but if memory serves me right, X is the action button. In the Japanese version, in order to run, you must hold the up direction on the D-pad while holding X. For North America, I'm pretty sure it's circle for that action. Please correct me in the comments if I'm wrong about that. The thing that makes movement even more challenging than it already is the fact that camera angles are completely fixed. Because this game uses pre-rendered backgrounds, the camera is totally static and will only change its angle once your character passes a certain threshold at the end of the screen that triggers an angle change. Since many of these areas consist of hallways, catwalks, small rooms, and corridors, in the event enemies are placed in that area, sometimes they will appear either off camera, their position in the hallway, or room not being readily visible. Once they spot you, they start moving, and because the zombie pathfinding in particular is especially aimless in nature, all of these factors can come together to create some pretty tough challenges if you're trying to avoid them. I did learn that there are ways you can actually influence and manipulate their movement, however, but that's something you learn after multiple playthroughs. Because of how the camera perspective tends to snap to the next scene, some might find it disorienting, since 1 second your character is moving toward the camera and the next angle they are moving to the left, completely changing the character's left and right orientation from the previous scene relative to the player's perspective. For me, however, this matches the control layout very well, and probably better than a more modern control solution. Having played the original Yakuza on the PlayStation 2, where fixed semi-dynamic camera angles are used, which tend to change their angle with a similar snap as they do in the original Resident Evil, but use a more modern movement control setup, in the moments where the camera does snap into the next screen, Kiryu might accidentally lurch into some totally different or even opposite direction, since movement was moved away from the character's perspective and instead the camera's perspective. It's neither here nor there. I'm not trying to say Yakuza controls worse than Resident Evil, but I do find that thanks to this specific application of the movement being tied to the character's perspective, it kind of eliminates the guesswork of trying to predict where to adjust your movement input at the change of the scene. Weapon characteristics are also a major factor of Resident Evil's gameplay design. Of course, you have a number of different weapons, and which weapons are open to you can actually depend on which character you choose to play as. The combat knife is a short-ranged melee weapon that never runs out of ammo and doesn't break. For many, it is a last resort weapon, but for those skilled enough, it's all that's necessary. It does a fair amount of damage, but takes some skill to use effectively. The Beretta is a 9mm handgun, which is used by both Chris and Jill. Each magazine holds 15 rounds, and it does a fair amount of damage to enemies, and can even deal a fair amount of knockback to enemies, even hunters in the later part of the game. There is a chance that a critical hit can be landed, though the chances vary between each character. The shotgun is a more powerful weapon. It can hold up to 7 rounds at a time and deals heavier damage to enemies than the Beretta. If you let a zombie wander close enough to you, you can land a critical hit which pops their head off. There is a slight latency when you press the fire button to when your character actually pulls the trigger, and they also need time to work the pump action to chamber the next round. There is also the Magnum revolver. This is a heavy handgun that deals even more damage than the shotgun, and at a long range too. This holds up to 6 rounds and can make instant work of all late game enemies in one hit, even from medium range, which the shotgun certainly can't do. Because of the Magnum's recoil, it takes a beat for your character to recenter their aim after every shot, but if you're accurate, you should be able to score 1 kill per single shot, which is huge for this game. The grenade launcher is an interesting weapon because its strength against enemies depends quite a bit on what kind of ammunition you are using. It holds up to 6 rounds of one type of ammunition at a time. These ammunition types come in 3 different flavors: acid, explosive, and incendiary. While normal enemies can be easily felled by one of any of these ammo types, bosses can have certain weaknesses to them depending on their type. The snake, Yawn, is especially weak to the acid shot. Plant 42 is especially weak to the incendiary shot. And the giant spider in the cave is especially sensitive to either the incendiary or acid shots. Explosive shots are effective against the tyrant. That's not all about the grenade launcher, however. One of the key characteristics of this weapon that makes it unique to every other weapon in the game is how it fires its projectiles. Because it is a grenade launcher, it actually fires its round in a shallow arc at a relatively short range, in contrast to the previous weapons, which are hit scan, except for the knife, of course. This means that while using the grenade launcher, you have to mind your position relative to the enemy you're engaging. It's pretty easy to intuit how to predict where a launched projectile will travel, so it's not especially difficult, but different nonetheless. Also, the grenade launcher can only be used by Jill. There is also the flamethrower. The flamethrower isn't a conventional weapon like the others, since, at least on a first-time playthrough, it is only used to solve puzzles and to fight the giant spider in the caves optionally. The flamethrower fires a strong flame at relatively short range that can deal serious damage to enemies that are especially weak to fire-based weapons and ammo. These also have a finite amount of ammo and can't be reloaded, and are meant to be treated as disposable, as opposed to the more regular weapons. The rocket launcher is the most powerful weapon in the game. It is the final weapon you are able to use in the game on a normal playthrough, but can be unlocked if you manage a playthrough of the entire game in less than 3 hours. The rocket launcher fires a projectile that is guaranteed to one-shot any enemy in its path. It can one-shot the tyrant, totally decimating him, so no other enemy stands a chance against it. It still fires a projectile, so the projectile does travel and takes time to move from point A to point B, not hit scan in other words, so it is possible to miss your target with the rocket launcher if your aim isn't accurate. Weapon reloading can be performed one of 2 ways. You can either manually reload the weapon by opening your inventory and combining the weapon with its corresponding ammunition, or you can fire the weapon while it's empty to prompt your character to reload it. Ideally, you would like to keep track of the amount of ammo you have remaining to avoid the need to reload by surprise during a critical moment while in combat. Checking your status in the game is as simple as opening the pause menu. There you will see your equipped weapon, how much ammo it has left, and your character's health status, which starts as a green line, then goes to yellow, orange, and red as they take damage. Future ports of the game would come up with creative ways of displaying this that serves as a quality of life improvement over having to constantly check the pause menu, but this comes with its own conveniences, especially when it comes to boss fights. Using the pause menu to reload your weapon is a really great way to pause the action in the game in general. It allows you to assess your character's status and decide whether or not to use a healing item without the pressure of a boss constantly pursuing you. While having that kind of infinite time to breathe during a battle with a boss might be comedic in real life terms, in a gameplay sense, having that opportunity to plan for your next move is pretty helpful. Boss fights are interesting given the nature of movement in this game, and while it isn't really conducive to combat at all, the nature of these fights is simplified enough that it really isn't such a big deal. Bosses aren't very tough, and most of them aren't even really that strong either. Their damage output isn't as high as their appearance might suggest, especially with the giant snake in Plant 42. Generally, the strategy of picking a relatively safe spot, blasting them 1 or 2 times, moving to another spot and blasting them a couple of more times is a strategy I've found works well. The Tyrant is especially surprisingly easily felled. In the first encounter with the Tyrant, if you have the Magnum or the grenade launcher, he can go down in as little as 3 accurate hits. Even in your second encounter with him, he's really not that tough. Again, blasting him with enough strong, accurate shots can end the battle well before your time limit is up. It kind of makes you wonder what exactly about him makes him the ultimate life form. Tyrant can take you out quickly if you're careless, but he can go down just as easily if you're good enough, so it's pretty balanced in that way, I suppose. I would argue that saving in Resident Evil is just as much an integrated part of the game's survival mechanics as anything else. Saving is done manually and can only be done so at one of the old typewriters and requires 1 unit of ink ribbons, which only appear throughout the game as discoverable items scattered throughout the mansion and its related areas, as is the case with everything else. They come in fixed amounts, usually 3 units per pickup. Once you use one, that is the unit of ink ribbons used. This means that there are a finite number of possible times you could actually save in a single playthrough. While the severity of the scarcity of these ink ribbons is reliant purely on the player's own perception of ink ribbon scarcity, the actual number of ink ribbons available throughout the game is actually quite high, and running out of them is incredibly unlikely. The game's save feature takes on a unique position as far as saving in games traditionally goes. At first, it's just a way to record and save your progress to a memory card so you can come back later. But as you replay the game, you might find yourself feeling it increasingly unnecessary to save as you become more familiar with the game, and it becomes more of a risk versus reward affair. The more you save, the more in-game time is spent performing a non-plot critical action, which can reduce your chances of finishing the game within the target time frame. Every time you finish the story for either Chris or Jill, the game ranks you based on the time it took you to complete the game and the number of saves you used. The shorter the time frame it took you to finish the game and the fewer saves you performed, the higher your internal rank would be, and you would receive a certain kind of reward. Saving, then, becomes a bit of a gamble. How much progress can you make, and how quickly can you do it? Can you do it fast enough to rule out the necessity of saving? After all, if you die, you lose all that progress and have to start again from your last save. It creates a situation where the higher the player's skill, the more they can totally forego the need to save at all. One of the elements critical to your survival in Resident Evil is health recovery. Unless you're so good at the game that you can manage a no damage run, you're probably going to get hit enough times to necessitate the use of healing items of some kind. While medical spray, which behaves as a full heal, does show up occasionally, you're not likely to run into them often enough to solely rely on them. It might not even be worth using them for every time you need healing to begin with. On top of that, medical spray is ineffective against the poison status effect you're likely to encounter, especially at the game's midpoint. This is where herbs become essential. Herbs come in 3 different types: green, blue, and red. Green herbs can heal you, blue herbs can act as an antidote in the event you're poisoned, and red herbs are actually useless by themselves. While green and blue herbs have their own standalone effects, they can become even more effective when combined. Combining 2 green herbs can create a healing item that is almost as effective as medical spray. Combining 3 green herbs can recover even more health. However, combining a green and red herb can give you a full heal. Combining a green herb with a blue herb can heal you a little and eliminate poison effects. Combining 2 green herbs and a blue herb will recover more health and cure poison. And 1 green herb, 1 red herb, and 1 blue herb will give you a massive heal and cure you of poison. It is a fairly rudimentary crafting system, but it can be helpful for those who want to maximize the effects of herbs, since, again, these herbs are a finite resource in the game and might possibly be the easiest to exhaust. The safe rooms are your main places of respite. While enemies you kill don't respawn, your safest areas in the game are the safe rooms, which exist in nearly every part of the map. There are 2 in the mansion, both on opposite sides of the first floor from each other, 1 in the guardhouse, 1 in the caves, and 1 in the laboratory. The safe rooms not only allow you to save, but this is your primary spot for item management. Each safe room has an item box, which has more storage space in there than you will ever need. You are able to swap your items from your inventory in and out of the box whenever you have access to it to change your loadout for whatever your next intended task will be. What adds to the convenience of these item boxes is the fact that no matter which box you put which items into, they will show up in every box in the game, regardless of where you are. Swapping items in and out at will when you need them or when you wish to save them for later is something that can be learned and streamlined on repeat playthroughs. Since managing your inventory is essential in Resident Evil, you will be interacting with the item box fairly often. Probably the biggest differentiating factor in the gameplay for Resident Evil is its 2 different stories you can follow. From the beginning of a new game, you have a choice between either Chris Redfield or Jill Valentine. Each character has a difficulty level, with Jill being easy and Chris being hard. However, there is some nuance in this. The easy and hard labels correspond almost exclusively to the total number of inventory slots each character has available. Jill has 8 inventory slots and Chris has 6. That is the main separating factor between the two, and where these difficulty labels come from, which makes sense from a certain perspective. Since Jill has more slots than Chris, it allows the player far more flexibility in terms of how much weapons and ammo they can carry along with the more plot-sensitive puzzle-solving items, whereas with Chris, the player is forced to be more shrewd in their item and weapon loadouts. Carrying less also means that Chris might be forced to dodge enemies more often than engage them. I believe it's this aspect of the game in particular that makes Chris's experience of the game particularly tricky for new players, especially if they are just starting out as him. Jill also has the advantage of having an exclusive weapon, the grenade launcher, which is basically an enemy delete. She also has access to the Magnum, which can double her ability to one-shot enemies. She also has the ability to pick locks to doors that otherwise would require a small key. Chris must rely on small keys in order to access certain doors, though later in the game, these doors aren't entirely necessary for progression. One of the disadvantages Jill has is the fact that if you load her out with a shotgun and or grenade launcher, it will actually negatively impact her running speed, making it potentially more difficult to dodge enemies. She is also not very proficient with the combat knife, lacking range, attack speed, and power. Chris, on the other hand, does not become overladen and his travel speed remains consistent regardless of loadout. He is much more proficient with the combat knife, meaning he can take down enemies easier using just a knife, and he has higher resistance to damage. Jill might have the ability to hit hard, but she can't sustain the kind of damage that Chris can. Because of this, Jill's tactics are basically shoot and scoot, whereas Chris can afford a tank and spank strategy if the situation calls for it. Because of this, I feel that while Chris's campaign might be slightly more complicated by the lack of access to powerful weapons in the early game and his inability to readily access certain doors and his overall lack of inventory, I find that the Jill versus Chris dynamic of the game is surprisingly well balanced, offering a slight variation on what is effectively the same game, which forces players to rethink their strategies, both in their required micro decisions and their map navigation optimization. Resident Evil is a survival horror game, that much is true. But one thing you might notice after your first playthrough as Chris and Jill is the fact that there really is no variation in the puzzles and their solutions themselves. That being, once you've gotten the solution, that's it. There's no randomization factor or anything that keeps the puzzles fresh. And yet despite this, Resident Evil becomes incredibly replayable if you allow yourself to indulge its meta challenges. It might seem asinine to immediately go back and replay a single-player campaign that took you 7 to 9 hours to complete, but this is what Resident Evil wants, because it turns out that the developers knew quite well that the game could be beaten in much shorter time than the standard first-time playthrough. It might sound crazy to say, but after you've beaten Chris and Jill's stories for the first time, the game really opens itself into a whole new world. On the face of it, I wouldn't blame anyone for saying that Resident Evil's puzzles aren't really that difficult to solve. In fact, they might even be brain dead in some cases. Why would anyone want to go back to redo those puzzles when it was really the story you were doing it all for? Maybe to get the best possible ending for each character? Playing Resident Evil so many times back to back has taught me that Resident Evil isn't just about the puzzles. It isn't just about the story either. Once you've gotten familiar enough with the game to finish both stories at least once, you realize that it isn't at all implausible to speedrun the game. It might sound crazy, but by its own design, Resident Evil is asking to be replayed and finished as fast as possible. This is evidenced by the fact that the game actually rewards you for meeting its unstated challenge of finishing the game in less than 3 hours. Finishing the game in less than 3 hours unlocks immediate use of the rocket launcher used at the end of the game to kill the tyrant on the helipad. Not only do you get the rocket launcher, but it has unlimited ammo. This means that when you start that save again, you will be allowed to wreak havoc with the rocket launcher, one-shotting every enemy you can, leading to a potentially faster completion time since it trivializes inventory management even with Chris. Getting the best ending also opens Chris and Jill to the closet room where you can have them wear different costumes on your next playthrough. Resident Evil, then, by its design, is a survival horror game for the first couple of playthroughs. Experiencing the story and ducking around corners and navigating narrow, darkened hallways with zombies, hunters, or dogs roaming the area, not knowing if an enemy will be somewhere or how many there will be. Your repeat playthroughs, however, stop being about survival horror and the story, and they are now about the game's meta challenge. The puzzles themselves are no longer puzzles, but instead, the entire game is a puzzle. It stops being a collection of logic puzzles and combat encounters, but now a logistics puzzle to minimize visits to the item box, to make as much progress as possible in as little time as possible with as few saves as possible. I don't know how else to describe it, but for me, repeat playthroughs made me so intimately aware of the game that I learned movement and attack patterns of all the regular enemies encountered in the game, and started treating them less as enemies and more as obstacles which are best left avoided or eliminated depending on my own convenience. I don't have to worry about two zombies flanking me in a corner because I can rely on the fact that their pathfinding logic will allow a very generous opening for me to run through long before they have the opportunity to actually hit me. I don't have to think too much about the hunters jumping at me because I know that if they are out of my sight, it's a feint attack meant to force me to waste a round of ammunition and open me up to an attack while I recover from the recoil. I know how close a zombie is allowed to get before I can reliably pop his head with a single shotgun shell. All of these things I learned in repeat playthroughs, and every successive playthrough taught me a new way to navigate the mansion to fulfill certain quests in the game faster than the last time. In this case, it becomes somewhat arcade-like. I can't deny that it does somewhat take away from the mystique of the game's story and atmosphere, but if you choose to impose more challenges on yourself for completion, like limited or no saves, or finishing the game within a certain amount of time, or doing a knife-only run, etc., you'll find that you kind of create your own horror experience, since it's really forcing you to get good at the game's mechanics. It's so solidly designed, the end to its gameplay stretches only as far as your imagination. I'm not a speedrunner of games, but even I found the idea of hitting that sub 3-hour completion time challenge irresistible enough to actually go for and achieve it. While I'm sure people find its sequels like Resident Evil 2 or Resident Evil 4 to have more interesting mechanics and stories as a whole, what the original Resident Evil has is a core game design that offers a tight gameplay experience that could very feasibly be finished in a single sitting. It all depends on your skills at the game. But as everyone probably already knows, of all the Resident Evil games, the first one has seen the highest number of different iterations over the years. We have had the original, the director's cut, the DualShock edition, the remake, and the HD remaster of the remake. We also have ports of the Sega Saturn and Nintendo DS, which both offer their own exclusive content to the game. And so the journey doesn't end with just some playthroughs of the original version of the game. What I've basically done is I've used the base game from the PlayStation original, to which I will compare the other different permutations of the game. Since I have the PlayStation Director's Cut, which itself contains the original game as well as a beginner and arranged mode, I will look at those versions as well as the base Saturn game and its exclusive content, and so on and so forth. The hope here is that I will deliver potentially the most comprehensive comparative analysis of the first Resident Evil I possibly can, given the limitations my production has on the scope of this video. So without further ado, let's begin this comparison with the PlayStation Director's Cut's Beginner Mode. It might sound unnecessary to even explore this game mode at all, since generally it's more or less the same game as the base game, but made easier. But it is a different enough experience that I believe it warrants some kind of discussion here. As far as similarities are concerned, they are plenty. Everything is exactly where you expect it to be. Every enemy, every weapon, every herb, every boss, cutscene, etc. It's all exactly in the same place it always was. Beginner mode doesn't do much of anything to simplify the game's layout. It is a perfect match for the base game's layout and structure across both Chris and Jill's respective stories. Even their respective balancing is identical with regards to weapons, proficiencies, and toughness, although I do find it a little funny choosing between an easy and hard difficulty on the beginner game mode. It muddies the water somewhat on the difficulty labeling for the game, but not in a way that meaningfully impacts the way you interact with it. Everything from enemy behavior and HP remains exactly as it was in the original, but what changed has everything to do with your character's own stats. Chris and Jill both have tighter defense and HP than before. This basically means that your strategies when fighting bosses essentially can amount to simply tanking damage and blasting them into submission, save for the Tyrant, of course. You also do a lot more damage, even with basic weapons than before, which means you can be a lot more liberal with how you engage with enemies. With Jill, I encountered one scenario where a zombie went down in just 2 rounds from the Beretta with no headshot. Both Jill and Chris both have the chance to deal a critical hit in the form of a headshot with the Beretta, which instantly kills a zombie, but the chances are slightly higher here with Jill. However, it wasn't even necessary. I'm not entirely sure how the game decides how many rounds a zombie can take before they are downed permanently, since I've had one zombie take up to 7 rounds and as little as 2. While other enemies have fixed numbers of rounds from certain weapons they can take, zombies with the Beretta seem a bit random, but I digress. While Chris's HP stat is still higher than Jill's because of this, matched with the increased damage output to enemies means that the threat of enemies has been greatly diminished. This also means that depending on your skill level going into this mode, healing herbs might be rendered somewhat superfluous. On top of this, one of the key distinctions between this and the base version of the game that is possibly more noteworthy than anything else is the fact that both ink ribbons and ammunition numbers are doubled from the base game. For example, every time you picked up ink ribbons in the regular game, it would come with 3 units. Beretta magazines came with 15 rounds. Shotgun shells came in boxes of 7. The Magnum and grenade launcher rounds in cases of 6. On beginner mode, these numbers are doubled. Now you get 6 ink ribbons per pickup, 30 Beretta rounds per magazine, 14 shotgun shells per box, and 12 rounds of grenade launcher and Magnum rounds. This effectively turns the game into something resembling a potential action game, where you are almost encouraged to clear out every area you walk through. The only exception, of course, are the naked zombies in the laboratory, which always respawn, although there's nothing stopping you from taking them out every time you wish. Beginner mode showers you with so much ammo, you might as well burn through it here if you feel you must. Beginner mode was apparently a game mode included specifically for the North American market, which had a more difficult iteration of the game than Japan to prevent people from simply finishing it in a single rental period, never buying the game in the first place. The director's cut, I guess, offers the beginner mode as a bit of an apology for the higher difficulty of the original North American version. This includes the auto-aim that was standard in the Japanese version, all versions of the Japanese version, which automatically snaps your character to aim directly at the nearest enemy once prompted to raise their weapon. More than anything else though, I found that beginner mode is a great mode to learn the most optimal path through the game after your first playthrough on the director's cut's original mode. Of course, beginner mode is a great mode to start out on, but even if you play through for the first time on the standard original mode, Going to beginner mode right after provides an environment where you can try out different ways of navigating the various areas of the game to find the fastest ways to get through them. By that point, you should still have the solutions and locations for all the puzzles fresh in your memory. The beginner mode serves as a great test bed for future potential speedruns, or at the very least, attempts to finish the game in under 3 hours. This is where I think, even for experienced players, beginner mode can shine since enemies are nerfed, you are tougher, and deal more damage and can go around armed to the teeth with whichever weapons you choose to equip yourself. It's actually pretty genius in a way, since you get to become more familiar with the different routes Jill and Chris take through the mansion initially, managing the order of the different puzzles with much lower stakes. It gives you the chance to learn how to dodge past enemies if you want to practice, and even gives you a chance to get the best ending for your specified character in the event you didn't manage that previously. There is so much you can get out of beginner mode if you give it a chance. Its differences might not be large in number, but it is changed enough while simultaneously remaining similar enough to allow for player experimentation for potentially faster runs when returning to the base game or even moving on to the arranged mode. The Sega Saturn is one of those consoles that I think many have actually forgotten even got a Resident Evil game at all. Resident Evil 2 was deemed unfeasible to be brought to the Saturn thanks to its expanded scope and architectural difficulties that came with the Saturn's dual CPU setup. While people like me might have the knee-jerk reaction of trying to defend the Saturn against this fact, the realities of that port becomes pretty clear when you visit the port of the first game the Saturn received. On a technical level, the Saturn version of the game is really held together by hopes and dreams. While the Saturn did get an incredible port of Quake, Resident Evil really does show the limitations of the Saturn. The first thing that is clearly noticeable is the loading times. The loading times on the PS1 version were always hidden behind the animations of the doors opening. While many have complained about these loading times as they are, I can at least say, regardless of what one might feel about them as they exist on the PS1, they are at least smooth. The Saturn port, I can't say that. Every single time you open a door or move to a different area, the door will not open smoothly. They will always encounter huge stutters, and it will sometimes hang in some cases before the next scene actually appears on screen. There were a couple of times during my playthroughs on the Saturn where I was legitimately afraid that if I changed rooms too frequently, the Saturn would just crash. Luckily, that never happened, but the behavior of the loading times was so unstable, it really didn't inspire much confidence. The enemy behaviors are all identical to the PS1 version, but how the Saturn places enemies, despite the fact it is a symptom of certain hardware limitations, adds an interesting twist. This isn't in every case, but early on there is an area of the mansion where there are two zombies, each placed roughly on opposite ends of a hallway from one another. If you take out one of them, but avoid the other and leave the area on their side, leave and re-enter, that zombie will not spawn in their original place, but will actually spawn in where the zombie you just killed originally was. This can kind of throw you for a loop if you're familiar with the game. Presentation-wise, the Saturn can match the PlayStation, although I couldn't help but to get the sense that the character models have slightly lower resolution textures, but have higher polygon counts, or maybe the character models just look different because the Saturn's polygon primitives are quads, but besides that, the Saturn version looks practically identical for all intents and purposes. As far as performance goes, one of the interesting things I found about the Saturn version is that while the game does maintain roughly the same level of performance as the PlayStation version, there was one instance while in the caves just before the laboratory entrance where if you allow all the snakes to appear on screen at once, the game will suffer slowdown. This kind of surprised me when I first encountered it, but this was the only area where I found that there were any serious performance issues. Of course, one can't go without mentioning the issue of transparency effects. The Saturn is well known by those familiar with it that accomplishing transparency effects with the Saturn's hardware is a lot of trouble given its eccentric hardware. While I'm pretty sure that console is technically capable of producing those types of effects via one of its VDP chips, because of the Saturn's complicated hardware arrangement and how it handled these kinds of effects, most developers found it more efficient to go the route of using a texture and applying a dither filter over it. This means for things like water, glass, or in Resident Evil's case, smoke, the effect is clearly visible, and in low quality captures like mine, even show a strange rainbow artifact, which looks a bit strange, kind of neat, and serves to highlight the effect even more. From a tactile standpoint, I have to say that the Saturn's control feels as though it was built for this layout of control scheme. Since the game is only really designed around the use of two face buttons, A and B are extremely accessible for all of Resident Evil's major actions. A is your general action button for using your weapon, interacting with environmental elements, and entering rooms or activating elevators. The B button is held while moving to run. Using your weapon works the same way as it does on the PlayStation and DS versions, where you hold the R bumper and attack using the A button. I personally found that the button placement was the most intuitive for this control scheme in contrast to the PlayStation and DS versions. But what really pushes the Saturn's control over the edge, at least among the ports in terms of control feel and ergonomics, is the D-pad. The floating circle pad makes smooth movement a lot easier, since hitting the spaces between the four cardinal directions is significantly easier and makes avoiding enemies simpler, because you can feel confident that you are actuating an input between those cardinal directions because of how the circular shape of the D-pad allows you to float between the cardinal directions, whereas a standard cross-shaped D-pad is a bit trickier. In essence, the Saturn D-pad is basically everything great about the D-pad for this game, but with the illusion of the free-floating movement of an analog stick. It's really the best of both worlds, and I strongly feel that despite the fact that this is a port of the original developed for the PlayStation, this control scheme works perfectly for this controller. When it comes to the matter of the core game and its contents, it is virtually identical to the original PlayStation version of the game. The layout of the various items and weapons and ammo are all where you expect them to be if you're at all familiar with the PlayStation original. However, this version of the game isn't without its own variations, small as they might be. For instance, the Saturn version of the game introduces a new enemy variety. These new enemies are called ticks, which, because the new appearance and cry they make basically behave identically to the hunter. They are generally felled by one round from the Magnum and have the same jump attack and low sweep combo that the hunter is known for. These enemies appear in the later part of the game, especially replacing the hunters in the caves below the courtyard. The Saturn version of the game also features a surprise second tyrant. Dubbed T002, this tyrant appears mere seconds after your first encounter with the tyrant in the laboratory. What's cool about this is that the developers actually added an additional tyrant tank in the room, which contains the first tyrant. It is so inconspicuously placed that you probably didn't even notice it until the cutscene revealing the second tyrant actually plays out. This tyrant is basically identical to the first in terms of behavior and HP. 3 magnum rounds and he's done. Really, this second tyrant serves as a bit of an ammo check at the end of the game, and while not particularly difficult, is a pretty interesting twist on the game, since it is basically the game asking you if you really prepared for the final face-off on the helipad. Strangely, a number of enemies have new voices. Crows have a much less intimidating sound when they are at idle. While they do caw like they do in the original, it's only when they attack you. It's kind of a bizarre change that makes the crows largely less intimidating, in my opinion. The zombies also have different voices. While some of the voice clips from the original remain, the newer voices are much more prevalent and may be divisive to those who could be potentially sensitive to that sort of detail. Probably the most confounding change, however, is the chemistry room security keypad puzzle. In the original game, you find the code to the chemistry room in the guardhouse by going into the large lounge area and checking the pool table. The pool table is situated in such a way where the balls and pool cues form the face of a clock, and they are meant to tell a time, which serves as the 3-digit code with which you use to unlock the chemistry room door. In the original, it is as easy as going to the far side of the table, pressing the action button, and the game reads the time for you. The Saturn version forces you to look at it manually and figure it out for yourself. It does not tell you what time the pool table reads. This would be totally fine if it weren't for the fact that the scene is far too dark to actually see. This is a bit of a sore point for me because on my initial run as Jill, I was on pace to finish the game in less than 3 hours when this part hit me and left me stuck for a half hour. Eventually, I devised a way to bypass the pool table entirely by manipulating the keypad so that it would light up in a particular way to set up an unlock state. The way the keypad works is that every number lights up a certain number of lights that align with the keypad. To unlock the room, all the lights must be lit, though some buttons turn off certain lights and light up in specific patterns based on your inputs. It's kind of like a nightmare difficulty version of the puzzle to access Eggman's secret base in Sonic Adventure. My bypass strategy ended up being to hit all the numbers except for 5 in a square pattern until the lights lit up in such a way where I could eventually fill the remaining blank lights based on the easiest to remember light up pattern. Even though this method worked, it really made me wish that I could actually see the hint I was intended to use to unlock the door, rather than using this brute force method. Aside from those changes, the experience of the game is largely identical to the PlayStation original, as one might expect. The difficulty and balancing between both Chris and Jill are nominally identical to how it exists on the PlayStation version, and the number of ammo and ink ribbon pickups and the amount of units found are the same as they are on the PlayStation DX version's original mode. Aside from some small twists here and there and some technical quirks symptomatic of the Saturn's own hardware-related idiosyncrasies, it offers players the full-fat experience that existed on the PlayStation with little compromise. I'm willing to bet that Saturn owners were happy they got this port, or at least when I first played it back in 2020, I was happy with this version. Jumping to classic mode in Deadly Silence, there are a number of changes made from the original that are apparent from the outset. This comes in the form of the game's overall presentation, both graphically and in its performance and audio. First of all, it must be noted that the fact you can take a full fat PS1 experience on the go in a handheld device is mind-blowing for 2006. This isn't just a straight conversion of the PlayStation original to the DS, it is an enhanced port. This version of the game retains everything from the original, including the FMV sequences, which is almost as astounding a feat since fitting those video sequences on a DS game card was not that much easier than what was managed on the Nintendo 64 port of Resident Evil 2. All the audio cues, AI behaviors, areas of the mansion, and everything else from the original carry over exactly as you remember. On top of retaining original elements from the PlayStation original, it also offers higher polygon counts on all character models and significantly higher resolution texture work on those characters. What's also highly noticeable is that some character animations have been reworked, and this can especially be seen in the zombie enemies, who have a wider range of motion and more discernible features that were difficult to notice in the original. And to top it all off, the DS port manages to include more frames of animation for the zombies, making their movements especially more smooth and dynamic in contrast to the original. The DS version maintains the same pre-rendered backgrounds and does incorporate some of the newer camera angles introduced in the director's cut version, though it mostly sticks to the original on classic mode from my experience. But, of course, it isn't without its own cutbacks. These cutbacks were largely thanks to the lower screen resolutions of the original DS and the limited storage of the DS game cards. The pre-rendered backgrounds, while maintained, contain compression artifacts like more pronounced color banding and macro blocking. While the 5th generation console versions weren't free of these compromises themselves, they were especially pronounced on the DS version, especially if you play it on either the DSi XL or the 3DS XL. The FMVs are also quite compressed as well. While this port of the game does keep the entirety of all the original game's FMVs, including an uncensored, though still grayscale version of the opening FMV, the other FMVs in the game suffer from the telltale compression artifacts, especially macro blocking and reduced motion clarity thanks to the aggressive file compression and resolution downscaling of the original video and halved frame rates in order to minimize video file sizes. The audio quality also suffers here. While some tracks aren't terribly affected by compression of audio tracks, surprisingly enough, many of the tracks and sound effects are very noticeably affected by the compression artifacts, most notably the audibly lower bitrate, which has been severely reduced, though not remarkably so compared to other handheld games of the time. Since DS hardware simply did not have the bandwidth nor hardware for high bitrate audio and video playback like the PlayStation had, these compromises needed to be made in order to make way for the game's enhancements. While probably not noticeable on original DS or DS Lite hardware, if you play on a DSi XL screen like I did, you'll immediately notice that the final FMV is the only one that sticks to the original DS screen's size, meaning that on the substantially larger screens of the DSi XL, the final video will appear as a small window inside the screen. Not a horrible thing, but I would imagine that stretching it to fit on the DSi XL's larger screens might render the video quality borderline unwatchable. As far as Resident Evil Deadly Silence's changes go within the game's classic mode, there aren't many. Most of the changes made have been to graphics and performance of in-engine assets, but the rest of the game is largely identical. The placement of all the items and everything else is pretty much exactly where it originally was in the 1996 original. Everything from AI behavior to enemy spawn points are entirely the same if you're familiar at all with the original version of the game, And this is largely thanks to the fact that the original game's engine and logic are retained, so there really is nothing out of the ordinary except for one thing. From the outset in the original game, you are typically armed with your combat knife, Beretta, and medical spray. But in Deadly Silence, the combat knife is no longer in your inventory. Actually, I assumed during my Jill playthrough that I simply didn't have a combat knife anymore. But it wasn't until my playthrough with Chris when I learned that pressing L would initiate the use of the combat knife. Pressing L and using R to attack with the knife is how it controls in this game. And in a way, this does make the game a little bit easier. Since the combat knife no longer takes an inventory slot like it did in the original, it helps make space in your inventory for other items and weapons. It also ensures that you will always have an ammo-less weapon on you at all times, so if you're not well practiced with it, it might be more of a desperate option than a real one. But because of this means that when you defeat the giant spider in the caves near the end of the game, the combat knife that is supposed to be hidden in the barrels there in the original has been removed. This is the only item placement change I can remember really standing out to me. It should be noted that the classic mode on the DS port is at the same difficulty level as the original mode on the PlayStation Director's Cut version. Another change that might probably come as no surprise to anyone about Resident Evil Deadly Silence is the fact that some parts of the game do utilize the touchscreen. While you are allowed to use the D-pad to navigate these interfaces using the DS touchscreen, the stylus is encouraged in many instances. When you go into the game's pause menu, you can manage your inventory using the touchscreen and stylus to switch out items or to examine or combine them. Any part of the game that involves a keypad of some kind also utilizes the DS exclusive feature, including the keypad at the entrance of the chemistry room in the guardhouse and the umbrella computer in the basement of the laboratory. Since the DS has two screens, this means that both screens are utilized for different kinds of displays. The bottom screen is where the game's main action takes place, as well as your pause menus and keypad interfaces. The top screen is your map, but it also displays which weapon you have currently equipped, how much ammo it has remaining, and even shows your character's health status. When it's black, it's normal, but after taking damage, it will go to yellow, to orange, and red, much like how health indicators in the pause menu of the original game did, except now you don't have to open the pause menu to check your HP status anymore, which is a huge boost to convenience and a time saver as well. One of the other differences made between the PlayStation version and the DS version, to round out on a technical note, is the loading times. The PlayStation version of the game used opening door animations to hide loading times when entering new rooms. These loading times were pretty quick, and the animations did help to make the transition from one room to the other feel smooth. This was thanks to the necessity of the PlayStation to stream game data from the disc. This is where the DS actually benefits from its cartridge-like storage medium. Since data is pretty much immediately accessible, these door animations are actually more of a decoration than anything else. While loading isn't instantaneous, they are significantly shorter than the PlayStation's, about twice the speed or somewhere thereabouts. That means that this version of the game is somewhat easier to reach the end of within the 3-hour limit, since the door animations can be entirely skipped. It should be noted, however, that the scenes when you're in an elevator cannot be skipped, which is a pretty interesting factoid I learned while playing the game. This means that you are able to skip loading screens to watch a short cutscene where you can't interact with anything before skipping another loading screen to get back into the game. It's very interesting. Now we arrive at the first major variation of Resident Evil. While the previously discussed versions of the game did offer some levels of variation on the original, structurally, they all followed an identical framework. Where I believe we get the first true variation of the original game is with the director's cut version's Arranged or Advanced Mode. There are differences abound in the director's cut version, but it is still fundamentally the same game. The changes were probably made as a means to trip up any of those who had all but trivialized the original game. Generally, the original game still serves as the underpinning for everything present in this version. The story is still here, the sequence of events still follows the same beats in roughly the same order, the enemies are all still here with no additions or subtractions, and the differences between Jill and Chris are largely the same in terms of available inventory slots and weapons. What also remains intact in the Japanese version is the snap aim. I neglected to mention it previously, but all Japanese versions of the game discussed thus far have a snap aim feature, which was deliberately removed from the North American version. This feature basically gives your character the automatic ability to target an enemy upon raising their weapon. This means that they can be made to snap 180 degrees if the enemy you wish to engage is directly behind your character. This snap aim, as I like to call it, prioritizes the enemy closest to the character, and in this director's cut version, it will become clearly evident that this isn't always an ideal feature, despite how handy it might have been in the original game. Bear in mind, again, that I'm speaking strictly about the Japanese versions of Resident Evil, since I only have ready access to that particular version of the game. When it comes to differences, I think the easiest place to start is in the game's presentation. The director's cut version of the game still has fixed camera angles, but now it features new exclusive camera angles that seemingly aim for a more cinematic experience. The balcony area in the main hall is a key example of this. There are also some new camera angles in the guardhouse, the blue room in the mansion just opposite of the dining room, the first floor, and the east wing area with the safe room includes 3 new angles. Those are the ones that come to mind, but that's not all. Since this version of the game was released as an apology for the delay of Resident Evil 2, the director's cut version of Resident Evil seems to benefit from a handful of higher quality renders of certain areas of the game. This includes the hallways in the guardhouse and the hallway which leads to the room where you first encounter Richard and the fight with Yawn. These visual upgrades help with visibility and depth perception thanks to their use of color and the way they are lit. The guardhouse scenes also benefit from the new camera angles as well. This version of the game also features new exclusive cutscenes that add to the underlying lore of the game. While it might demystify some of the big reveals at the end of the game for returning veteran players, it does add deeper world building and can serve as connective tissue between certain elements of the original game's story that rendered them part of the mystery. Probably the biggest changes with the game have to do with the game's layout. Resident Evil DX's Arranged Mode lives up to this name in the sense that if you were at all familiar with the original game's layout between either Chris or Jill or both, you will have to relearn a lot of it. What Arranged Mode basically does is it rearranges the placement of progression-sensitive items, weapons, ammo, and enemies. If you're someone like me who came from binging the base game in its various previously described forms, both as Chris and Jill, then this single change alone changes the way you interact with the game. The optimized sequence you might have devised to finish the game as quickly as possible goes completely out the window. It basically forces you to explore the mansion again to find the keys, medals, and ammo you need, whilst also dealing with new enemy placements and behavior. I can't emphasize enough just how much it upends the original sequence and flow of the original game. I can only imagine what this game might feel like if it went through a randomizer. In a way, this process of having to relearn the game is kind of fun and quite fresh. While this is mostly prevalent in the initial part of the game, before you leave the mansion the first time, it's enough of a twist that gives you a run for your money, especially when it comes to the broken metal that must be reassembled. That and the location of the blue gem are probably the biggest twists, as well as the requirement to find the wooden shield emblem. While item placement changes start to fall in line with their original placements in the original game, the challenge doesn't end there. Throughout the game, you are also faced with much stiffer enemy opposition. Where there were once no zombies, now there is at least one. Where there was one zombie, now there are three, one of which runs right at you. This is of particular note because these faster variants of the zombies, I believe, are operating on a sped up iteration of the regular zombies pathfinding logic. That means they are actually slower to respond to your attempts to manipulate their movement like you could in the original game. Instead of being able to force them to veer off in some opposite direction to leave a wide space for you to run through, these fast zombies make a beeline directly for you, forcing you to either flee or engage as opposed to dodge and run past. Some areas that had zombies in them now contain the Cerberus enemies instead, and areas that had the Cerberus will now feature the giant spiders in the late game. Enemy placement in certain areas also make navigation particularly hazardous, since there is even less room for error or contemplation, since you're more likely being set up to be flanked by two enemies. There is also a marked increased number of hunters in the last half of the arranged mode. Not only are hunters more prevalent in the late game, but they also have more HP than they did before. Hunters in the regular game usually took about 3 direct shotgun shells, 1 grenade from the grenade launcher, or 1 round from the Magnum. Now it takes about 2 rounds from the grenade launcher and the Magnum to take them out. Higher HP is noticeable across many enemies, but the game does compensate for this fact in a couple of ways. Ammo, especially as Jill, is a lot more plentiful throughout the game. In the event that you had gotten good at avoiding enemies in the first half of the game, you might find yourself armed to the teeth by the time you're re-entering the mansion and facing the hunters. Hunters all behave the same, thankfully, and don't seem to do any greater damage than they already did in the base game. But the game replaces zombies in the late game with hunters, especially in the basement, and it is here where I believe the game hits its main difficulty spike. While it's only really effective at catching you off guard the first time you encounter it, this kind of twist sees the return of the survival aspect of the game, which had largely been trivialized if you reached this stage in the base game where the challenge became optimizing the fastest possible path to the end of the game. There is a greater action aspect to the game because of this increase in ammo availability, since it incentivizes engaging in combat with enemies more often than not. But it also changes enough around to bring back the lost suspense between the loading screens when attempting sub 3-hour runs of the original game. The other way Arranged Mode makes up for increased enemy counts is the introduction of the chance to perform an instant kill. Basically, while using the Beretta, there is a random chance that your character can perform a headshot, which would effectively kill the enemy instantly. The advent of this feature opens the opportunity for the player to save ammo, and especially in Chris's early game where ammo is sparse relative to the enemy count, this can be incredibly helpful. Another difference in Arranged Mode actually has to do with both fights with the Tyrant. In both cases, the Tyrant's HP is significantly increased. While the helipad fight might be arguable that it is tied to the countdown timer than the HP of the Tyrant itself when the rocket launcher is tossed down to you, the initial encounter in the laboratory is definitely different. In the original version of the game and all its ports, the Tyrant took 3 direct hits from the Magnum before going down. Because of that, this fight could be finished in mere seconds. Even the second Tyrant in the Saturn port only took 3 Magnum rounds, much like the first. But here in Arranged Mode, the Tyrant can take a much more brutal punishment. This basically serves as an ammo check and forces you to really think about which weapon to use against him now and which one to preserve for the helipad fight, since chances are you aren't fending him off with just one of these weapons in both fights, like could be feasibly done in the original game. Well, unless you went knife only, I suppose. I should note, of course, that the helipad fight only happens if you are achieving one of the good endings. Probably one of the most interesting changes in the arranged mode of the game is how the guardhouse is changed. Not only does the sequence change slightly, but also the structure of the guardhouse is altered in a way that can really catch you off guard if you aren't careful. In the original version of the game, the guardhouse has a T-shaped hallway, which includes a door leading into the safe room on your character's right, one of the dormitories on the left, and a set of red double doors at the far end. In the center, there is an intersection leading to a hallway to the character's right. Down that hallway is a hole in the floor. If you step over that hole, a vine will come out from it and attempt to strangle your character. It will do this every time you walk over it. The only way to prevent this from happening is to block the hole to begin with. This is accomplished by pushing a gargoyle statue over it. Once it is placed correctly, it will remain there. If it isn't placed correctly, upon re-entering the hallway, the statue will be returned to its original place and you will have to try again. Puzzles in this game can be reset easily this way, and this particular puzzle constitutes just one of several block pushing styles of puzzles. On a second playthrough, this puzzle is less of a puzzle and more of a routine, but in the director's cut, it changes. Now there are 3 holes in the floor and only 1 statue. This means that you need to know where you want to go in order to place the statue in the right spot. The original hole location remains the same, but there is an additional hole just in front of the safe room door and another in front of the red double doors. As long as Plant 42 is still alive, you have to travel conscientiously through this area, ideally limiting visits to the safe room in order to minimize the risk of taking damage from Plant 42's surprise attacks. Also in the guardhouse, there is the question of the flooded basement, Neptune, and the final armor key. You originally find the key to the flood control panel in the basement in the bathtub after draining it in the first dormitory. Here, that isn't the case. You can only gain access to that room after defeating Plant 42. That means if you go for the V-Jolt route to that boss fight, you must brave the waters with Neptune and its mini versions without the safety of access to the flood control room. Then run back, fight Plant 42, then find the flood control room key, run back down, drain the basement, open the adjacent door, and in the ammunition room you will find the armor key. It totally redefines the sequence in which you navigate the guardhouse, and I believe that this serves as a perfect microcosm of the structure for the rest of the game. Again, Arranged Mode is fundamentally the same game as the original, but thanks to the shifting around of items, adding enemies, giving them more HP, and adding little tidbits of plot development and reworking some previous graphical assets, lends to the Arranged Mode of Resident Evil an experience new enough that it is worth revisiting the Spencer Mansion. It's not a proper Resident Evil 2, but it's a sufficient apology for those who were left waiting for a sequel after mastering the original game. It is effectively a new enough experience to justify the cost of buying the game a second time. Going back to the DS, we have a DS exclusive version of the whole game, and that is through its ReBirth mode. Resident Evil DS ReBirth sits in an interesting place, almost equidistant between the original game and the director's cut's arranged mode. It's hard to quantify just how much of the ReBirth mode comes from the original and which ideas are taken from the arranged mode, since the DS version isn't entirely bespoke unto itself. In fact, there are some aspects of the DS version that are even similar to the GameCube remake that aren't present in either of the previous iterations that this is a port of. The DS version of Resident Evil is a bit of an anomaly as a result of its time of release. Its bones, and indeed the vast majority of this game from a technical and gameplay perspective, are all derived from the PlayStation original, indicating that this is a port of the original. However, because it exists in the wake of the aforementioned Saturn port and the GameCube remake, it does contain content that is reminiscent, at least in spirit, of certain aspects of those games. Let's first start with what remains of the original game. Pretty much everything is exactly where it was in the original, save for one item which I will discuss later, since this is probably the single largest structural deviation this game takes from the original and makes it stand out from the DX Arranged Mode. Whether it's with Chris or Jill, your playthrough sequence that you learned from the original game remains almost entirely intact. Unlike in the DX Arranged Mode, where items are swapped around and enemies are given more HP in the DS ReBirth version, neither of those are the case. Enemies are the same as they were in the original in terms of HP, including bosses, and the item placements are the same as they always were. As far as similarities shared with the DX Arranged Mode go, the Arranged Mode's introduction of more enemies in places they were previously, and enemies in places they weren't in the original, returns here. The fast zombies also make their return, but I didn't find them to be as much of a threat as they were in the Arranged Mode for some reason. The ReBirth mode on DS opts to retain the original camera angles and many of the puzzles that have remained untouched by the use of the DS touchscreen are how they existed in the original as well. The game is virtually identical to the original mode, and even still, many of its deviations come from the arranged mode on the DX version of the game. But the story doesn't stop there. ReBirth might largely retread a lot of what the older games did, but it is its own experience introducing its own content which can only be done on the DS in many cases. One of the biggest differences between any of the prior versions of the DS version is it introduces a series of puzzles which require the use of either the microphone or the DS touchscreen. Specifically, there are two moments, I can remember at least, where the microphone is used as a means to interact with a scene in the game. These challenges are quite simple. One of them is to blow rhythmically into the microphone to resuscitate Richard when you initially find him after he's attacked by Yawn. I'm actually unsure what happens if you fail to perform this, since it's pretty simple to do. A similar puzzle happens when you are required to blow out 3 candles within a certain time limit in order to uncover something that is only discoverable in the dark. Specifically, in the taxidermy room, where the red gem is found in the deer head's eye. The puzzle is neat, specifically because it changes what was originally a puzzle based exclusively on one's ability to check their surroundings to one that, while requiring the same base skill set, adds an extra layer of figuring out what the light source actually is, as opposed to just searching the room for a light switch. Is it revolutionary? Probably not. But the added interactive layer, thanks to the additional hardware in the DS, makes for an interesting twist on a game that takes you off autopilot, at least for a second. The next and probably more significant twist on the original gameplay is the introduction of touchscreen-based puzzles. Your first introduction to these touchscreen puzzles is the addition of blue treasure boxes in the safe rooms. The treasure boxes usually contain items, while not plot sensitive, can offer some extra help in the form of additional ammo or health recovery. Blue treasure boxes are locked and can only be unlocked by matching the colored beads to their corresponding rings by rotating a pair of arrows to swap the positions of those beads within 4 moves. If you go beyond 4 moves, the whole puzzle resets and you must try it again. Of course, once you get to the final treasure box, you have to worry about swapping the positions of 4 beads at once, adding an extra layer of complexity and encouraging greater consideration for the moves you make. These puzzles are entirely optional, but increase in difficulty in a way that feels parallel to your progress through the game as a whole, and provide rewards that scale along with that, making them both highly accessible and rewarding to open, unless you're going for a speedrun, of course. The next set of touchscreen puzzles are not optional, however. Resident Evil DS basically adds touchscreen puzzles to parts where the original game only asked you to interact with certain environmental objects. These puzzles, much like the treasure box puzzles, also gradually increase in difficulty based on your progress through the mansion. One of the notable puzzles in the game is if you're able to bring Richard the serum and in his dying breath tells you to change the time on the clock in the dining room to a certain time. It isn't mandatory, but performing this task does net you a box of shotgun shells, which can be incredibly useful, especially later in the game. Another puzzle that is mandatory that represents this additional action in the form of touchscreen interaction is when you need to summon Yawn for the second bout. Where the original simply had you look at the piano in the corner of the room, this time it is replaced with a phonogram, one that looks similar to the one in the remake. You're asked to spin the record and play the tune to its conclusion in order to initiate the fight with Yawn, which then plays out exactly the way it did in the original. Another puzzle that I found particularly memorable is actually a couple of puzzles that must be finished back to back. This takes place in the guardhouse basement after escaping Neptune. In the original, you are asked simply to hit a switch to drain the room of floodwater, but here is probably the biggest subversion ReBirth has to offer veteran players. You still flip the switch, but when you do, instead of draining the water from the room, a shower on the ceiling begins to add poison into the flooded room, and you have very limited time to figure out how to drain the water before the poison takes effect and slowly kills you. In order to accomplish this, you must immediately move to the valve right next to where the switch is, and you must manually turn it using the touchscreen to light up the 4 lights to the valve's right side in order to open the drainage system. This is actually a pretty tense section. The first time you encounter it, especially since the rate you are asked to turn the valve is actually quite specific, and finding that turning rate is the biggest part of the challenge. Immediately after the imminent danger is dealt with, you then move over to the control panel where in the original game you press a button and it unlocks the armory room next door. Once again, ReBirth asks more of you. Interacting with the panel this time requires you to use your math skills, where you are asked to take the numbers 1 through 9 and place them in such a way in groups of 3 to match the sums of all the numbers above them, as well as placing the numbers in their designated spots to light all the lights to unlock the door. This was probably my favorite puzzle in the entire game because I really had to think about the best way to solve it. Puzzles like this stop the player in their tracks and force them, at least on an initial playthrough, to slow down and think about the solution to it. It's logical and is almost like a Sudoku puzzle, and it adds an interesting flavor of gameplay to this version while leveraging the DS's bespoke hardware and technology design, lending to it more substance in the form of interesting content that helps prevent veteran players from sleepwalking through it. Probably the most abstract puzzle is the last one, which features a pair of puzzles whose function is to restore power to the elevator in the laboratory, leading to the reveal of the Tyrant. These require you to rewire power so that all three circuits are reading in the red, given only limited options to complete this. At first, the difficulty probably comes from what exactly you're supposed to do with the stylus. But once you realize that the lines you draw to connect the other lines are to be positioned roughly relative to the amount of power you want to reroute from one line to the other, the puzzle's abstract nature fades away. Still, it can be pretty tricky to know just how high or low a line should be, but the core understanding of how you are meant to interface with this puzzle to begin with, I suspect anyway, is meant to be your primary hurdle. These added touchscreen and microphone puzzles in the ReBirth mode of Resident Evil DS do a lot to spice up a port which, at its core, is still extremely similar to the original game. It can be argued that these added puzzles are rendered more potent because they are imposed over the bones of the original mode's structure and sequence as opposed to adding an arranged mode unique to the DS. That feeling of being caught off guard as a reminder to keep one on their toes can leave the veteran player feeling as though they are really getting an experience worth the price of admission, especially when the game breaks the original sequence. The latter part of Resident Evil is meant to see an increase in difficulty with the introduction of hunters. Of course, Resident Evil DS ReBirth can't just introduce hunters, but must also increase the number of hunters and enemies in general. I think I've already mentioned this earlier, but it bears repeating. Part of ReBirth's gameplay direction moves it more firmly into the realm of an action game, probably in a similar vein as Resident Evil 2. More enemies means more ammo that can be found, and now ammo and health items can be dropped as well. Since some narrow pathways can see you facing down up to 3 hunters at once, or 4 zombies, or 3 Cerberus, blasting your way through them isn't a horrible idea, especially since they don't have the HP boost like they did in the Arranged Mode on PS1. But enemies taken out with your weapons isn't how you get dropped items. Instead, dropped items come from the knife segments, which are totally unique to the DS version. The knife segments are mini-games where you take on a first-person perspective and must fend against attacks by enemies that come at you, sometimes 2 or 3 at a time. All enemies come at you, including zombies, crows, Cerberus, hunters, and chimeras. You have 2 different attacks you can perform with the knife. Tapping the screen will prompt your character to stab the knife in that area, and drawing your stylus across the screen will prompt your character to perform a roughly 1-to-1 slash. Stabbing is a faster attack that can deal damage quickly, and while slashing is a slower attack, it is great in close quarters since it can stagger enemies and prevent them from landing a hit. There is also a parry you can perform where, at the moment an enemy's attack is about to land, you perform either a slash or a stab, and it will insta-kill that enemy. I've accomplished this both with the Cerberus and hunters. There is a clear wind-up to these attacks, however, so even with the stabbing attacks, your inputs must still be timed if you want to get the parry down. While it isn't necessary to parry every enemy, it does become core to the game when fighting Yawn for the 3rd time. This is where ReBirth sees a completely different track from both the original and arranged modes on PlayStation. If you want to get the book with the wolf medallion, it is no longer in the study where it is in the other versions of the game. Instead, it is in the guardhouse, where Plant 42 used to be, except Yawn comes for one more final bout. And not only that, but getting to Yawn means also navigating a guardhouse that has been repopulated by enemies, including a bee and hunters. This final bout with Yawn is in the first-person knife mode, where instead of using your guns, you must defeat him using only your knife skills. You are required to parry his attacks to open him to your own attacks, as well as hit him when his mouth is open. This is arguably the most intense part of the game, since it really tests your ability to effectively use the knife in this first-person mode. It serves as a mandatory skill check, since it is impossible to get into the laboratory without both the Wolf and Eagle medallions. While Yawn doesn't have a health bar, you can tell how much damage he's taken by seeing the pooling of blood collecting under his body. Usually, after every parry you perform, this puddle grows. Defeating him once and for all results in him dropping the book that contains the Wolf medallion. I've actually neglected to mention this before, but after the usual typical random knife segments, an enemy will drop something like a healing item or an herb or some ammo. Usually the amount of ammo is a partial unit, so instead of dropping a full 7 rounds of shotgun ammo, you'll get 3 instead. This gameplay style is so unique to the DS version that there is actually another gameplay style on the DS version called Master of Knifing, which is exclusively this gameplay style. Master of Knifing is basically a mini-game within Resident Evil Deadly Silence, which involves you taking on a gauntlet of enemies and culminating in a final fight with Yawn. This gameplay mode tests your knifing skills because you are basically given a single health bar to fight your way through rooms containing all the enemies in the game except for the chimeras, the bees, and the tyrant. This leaves a gauntlet of zombies, crows, hunters, Cerberus, and Yawn. It's a short mode, but it's a nice side distraction and serves as a compelling tech demo for what the DS is capable of, if nothing else at all. But this mode in itself is actually derivative of an alternative game mode from another port of Resident Evil, and that is Battle Mode on the Saturn. Upon finishing either Jill's or Chris's story on the Sega Saturn port of Resident Evil, you unlock Battle Mode. Battle Mode is essentially a gauntlet wherein you fight nearly every enemy in the game. The way this mode is structured is totally linear in progression. You start in the mansion corridors, then to the art room, go to the courtyard, then the caves, the laboratory generator room, and then the room that houses the tyrant. You fight everything, including the bosses. Each major section of this game mode is punctuated by visits to the area's safe room, where you can restock on items or switch out weapons. You first fight zombies, then crows, Cerberus, Yawn, spiders, Plant 42, hunters, the giant spider, the stronger zombies in the laboratory, the chimeras, and the tyrant. You actually have to fight the chimeras twice, and you are asked to do all of this with very limited ammo. You don't get ammo refreshes in the safe room breaks. What's given to you at the outset is what you have to work with, but since these enemies don't have increased HP and behave the exact same way as they did in the base game, it's not as daunting. This mode is definitely more about level memorization and optimization of weapon use against certain enemies. The game ranks you based on a number of factors, including how many healing items you have remaining and how long it took you to clear the whole game. It's very gamey and feels more like an arcade game than the Master of Knifing minigame on the DS version. But the presentation is such that it kind of matches the campy atmosphere of the game, odd as that sounds. This gameplay mode also shows off the 2 Saturn exclusive enemy types that are only in the battle mode. Zombie Wesker is one of them, which is a zombified version of Albert Wesker that takes a lot more damage than any of the other zombie enemies. The other is the Golden Tyrant, which is probably the toughest of the Tyrant variants discussed thus far. He takes several shots from the grenade launcher and the Magnum to finally defeat. And while the tactic used to defeat him is the same as it was in the other versions of the game so far discussed, he is probably the biggest time sink right alongside Zombie Wesker. One thing that carries over as a primary gameplay mechanic is the differences between Chris and Jill are retained from the base game. This includes everything from their skill with the combat knife, their resistance to damage, the number of inventory slots available to them, and the weapons to which they have access. That means that Jill gets all the weapons except for the rocket launcher, while Chris gets only the combat knife, Beretta, shotgun, and Magnum. There is also no compensation for the amount of ammo he starts out with, so you really have to use these limited resources as effectively as possible. Jill also has access to 3 medical spray cans, as opposed to Chris, who only has access to 2. This means that not only is Chris the hard mode for the battle mode in terms of completion difficulty, but he is also the most difficult to get a high ranking with because of his limited access to weapons and ammo, as well as healing items, since how much health you have remaining is another metric with which the game scores you. While the Saturn Battle Mode isn't really a fully fleshed out game mode like that of the DS ReBirth Mode, it is notable in as much that this kind of survival roguelike battle survival mode is something that carries through in many forms throughout future games in the series, including Resident Evil Requiem, which, as of making this video, just saw a comparable battle mode DLC essentially shadow dropped not too long ago. It's arguable that the inclusion of battle mode in the Saturn port might serve as a blueprint for the tradition of similar modes in the future mainline games, and for a port for a dying platform to have such an influence on a blockbuster series like Resident Evil, that isn't insignificant. In 2002, we had entered well into the 6th generation console cycle. With the release of the PlayStation 2 in 2000 and the Xbox and GameCube in 2001, 2002 marked the first full year of the 6th generation of game consoles, wherein all the major players were finally present and vying for a space in people's living rooms. With the Dreamcast already out of the picture before the Xbox and GameCube even being released, it was clear that the PlayStation 2 was a force to be reckoned with, and both Microsoft and Nintendo did a lot of work behind the scenes, striking up agreements for exclusivity or buying out whole studios to give their hardware compelling software to incentivize consumers to buy their console over the others. For Nintendo, this meant striking up a couple of deals with Capcom, one of which called for a complete remake of the first Resident Evil exclusively for the GameCube. And so we got Resident Evil Remake, the first in a broadening lineage of remakes that have become so popular in recent years. To this day, some people still say that this particular remake set the standard of how remakes are done. First, I want to make a full disclosure here. Since the GameCube original and the HD versions of Resident Evil Remake are essentially identical in terms of their content, I decided in the interest of saving disk space to record my GameCube version playthrough as Jill and my HD version playthrough as Chris. I captured the GameCube version from a Nintendo Wii using component cables at 480p and captured the HD version from the Steam port on PC from my Clevo laptop running the game at 720p. I chose this specific mid-tier 2013 gaming laptop as my device for PC capture mostly because I have a tiered system for which computer runs which games, because I'm a little weird about this. But also, it can come in handy for avoiding any potential compatibility hiccups. See my Crysis comparison video for more on that. While I don't think there is anything preventing the game from running on newer devices, a game like this is just too light for my other more overkill machines. Anyway, without further ado, let's get into what makes Resident Evil Remake so vastly different from all the other versions of the game that I've yet covered so far in this video. Resident Evil Remake for the GameCube is a brand new experience, totally unlike any of the previous versions of the game yet discussed, except for the fact that it is the same story taking place in the same setting with the same characters on the same timeline and the same general layout and sequence of core story beats, both in plot and in gameplay. It might sound like I just finished the video right then and there, but trust me, there is so much more that is different from the remake that we haven't even scratched the surface. In fact, there are so many differences that I might miss certain details, so if you notice anything missing and would like to add your input in the comments, please by all means feel free to do so. Let's first talk about graphics. The original Resident Evil was groundbreaking thanks to its technical trickery in its use of pre-rendered backgrounds and 3D character models alongside special effects and clever use of billboarded sprites. It wasn't an entirely new technique, as it was probably more famously featured in Rare's own Donkey Kong Country series of games on Nintendo's previous generation hardware. But Capcom's choice to utilize this technique for displaying highly detailed environments in the original PlayStation hardware made the game look ahead of its time and cutting edge, at least for the mid-90s. Now that we're on the GameCube, however, Capcom had access to hardware that outclassed the PlayStations in pretty much every conceivable way, and they really pushed the GameCube's capabilities. The background images in the remake illustrate a clear generational leap, not only in what was possible on consoles, but probably more so what professional workstations were capable of. The images of rooms and ceilings in the various areas featured in the Spencer Mansion show huge enhancements thanks to simulated realistic lighting and higher detailed materials and environments. Occasionally, animated background elements would actually consist of short animated FMVs, and in some fewer cases, entire scenes would be one giant FMV background. While the illusion of these backgrounds has sort of lost its effect thanks to the low-resolution nature of some of them now, thanks to the exponential increase in number of pixels available on screens as time moved on, as well as interactable objects that could be added to your inventory weren't lit with the scene because they were rendered in real time. For a 2002 game, visually, Resident Evil Remake looks impressive. Since the backgrounds were mostly displaying flat images superimposed over invisible collision meshes, this freed up considerable GameCube GPU resources for rendering extremely highly detailed character models with fluid animation. Some keyframed and some motion captured, highly advanced particle effects like fire and smoke, and all at a rock solid 30 frames per second. While I'm sure there are some instances where the frame rate dips slightly below the 30 FPS target, I didn't notice anything of the sort myself while running through the game, even in scenes where multiple enemies were on screen at once. It really is a technical showcase for the GameCube, especially for a game released so early in the console's life cycle. The HD remaster preserves this visual identity of the GameCube original, while adding a few subtle touches. The obvious, of course, is HD support with 720p and 1080p both being available, at least on PC, and an additional 16:9 aspect ratio support, which widens your field of view. You also get access to FXAA, which the GameCube version of the game obviously lacks. While the higher resolution itself helps greatly to mitigate the appearance of aliasing on the edges of characters, FXAA's post-processing adds an additional blur filter which helps to blend the characters into the backgrounds. Considering the fact that the lighting effects in the backgrounds aren't actually real and thus don't act as real light sources, it can be easy to see the clear separation of the character models as distinct from the backgrounds. With FXAA, while of course doesn't mitigate this fact entirely, it does help to minimize it greater, adding a potentially additional layer of immersion in the game's world. But it is a perfectly acceptable preference to also not apply any kind of anti-aliasing in the game's settings, of course. You don't need me to say it or validate it, but I just wanted to put it out there as something that is also perfectly valid, especially if you're playing it on a smaller screen at 1080p. While the backgrounds and character models in the remaster have all been touched up and enhanced for the more modern hardware of the time of its release, one thing that hasn't been touched up are the handful of FMV sequences that play during certain key moments in the game's story. These videos unfortunately don't seem to have seen any boost in resolution, at least not that I've been able to see, and as a result, if you're playing at 1080p and trigger one of these cutscenes, the pixelated artifacting of these old compressed video contrast heavily against the rest of the game, and end up looking worse than the in-engine cutscenes as a result. It's not game-breaking, but it was something that I noticed immediately. Since these cutscenes are relatively few and far between, it's nowhere near approaching offensive status, but it's extremely noticeable. I mentioned earlier the lack of light sources that the background elements simulate through a mix of FMVs and their interactions with pre-rendered backgrounds, but that doesn't mean there are no light sources at all. On a very subtle note, but distinct from the GameCube version of the game, whenever you light something on fire using a flamethrower or incendiary grenade or the kerosene in the lighter, the HD version adds to the resulting fire effect a unique light source that does interact with the real-time elements of the game. So that means it will cast light against your character and any surrounding characters or objects close enough to it. It's nothing extremely groundbreaking, but a neat addition to the game that adds just an extra bit of grounding of your character in the world. Regardless of which version of the game you play, the visuals are excellent, and while they do show their age now in a world of real-time ray tracing technology in practically every gaming compatible machine, these visuals still hold up surprisingly well, even on the GameCube original. It demonstrates a real generational leap from the PlayStation and goes to show just not only what game machines could manage to pull off at the time, but also demonstrated the kind of visuals that might theoretically be possible in future generations of hardware. While the GameCube version isn't perfect, especially with the massive stutters during dramatic camera angle changes in real-time cutscenes, from a playability standpoint, it is practically flawless, as long as you either play on a CRT or you upscale the progressive scan image from the GameCube or Wii before sending it to a modern big screen TV. I don't have a big screen TV, so it doesn't make any difference for me. Anyway, this game is pure eye candy, and that's really the last word I really have to say about it. The controls for this game are really fascinating, and again differ somewhat between Remake and Remaster. In the GameCube version, you are presented with 3 different options, and they are Type A, Type B, and Type C. To me, Type A feels most closely related to the original game, where your movement is tied to the analog stick. Except now, because it's an analog stick, you have 8 directions of movement that are clear and easy to know, which you couldn't really get in the DualShock control layout on the original, and could sometimes be finicky with the PlayStation D-pad. I would say, ultimately, the Saturn controller still takes first prize for me in this regard, but the GameCube is an easy second place. The run button is B, the action button is A, and your map and status screens are tied to Y and X, respectively. To aim your weapon, you use the right trigger. Type B is another variation of this style of control, except this time, movement is tied to the buttons. I honestly didn't spend much time at all in this control mode. Apparently, it's supposed to closely approximate the tactile feel of the PlayStation original, but I personally found it difficult to wrap my head around. Strangely enough, however, I didn't go with either Type A or B for my GameCube playthrough. Instead, I went with Type C, or what I like to call Shenmue mode. What's unique about this control layout is that forward movement is tied to the right trigger. Since the trigger is analog, you can control your character's movement speed based on how hard you squeeze it. This is all my opinion, of course, but I kind of want to share why this is kind of genius. The GameCube's triggers are analog, but, at least for Resident Evil, really only has a binary forward movement speed available: walking and running. If you know anything about the GameCube controller, it's that the triggers have a pretty long travel, but have a click near the bottom of its travel distance. This means that the walk and run speeds are very easy to deliberately switch between at will with just one slight movement that provides physical feedback in the form of a solid click. It also means that you don't need to input any additional actions from the analog stick on the controller just to move forward. This means that you can actually mitigate the chances of getting stuck on something that you can't see while trying to get somewhere the moment the camera angle changes, which is a pretty common issue in some cases on the original game, and can be even more so on the GameCube version, which has a significantly greater number of backgrounds and camera angle switches. As long as you position your character appropriately and just run straight, you are unlikely to run into any problems. This alone made the game incredibly easy to interface with, because I found that tying non-analog movement to an analog stick was a little uncanny, and I wasn't exactly confident that I would be able to adjust very quickly to the addition of countless new camera angles in every area. This leaves the analog stick free to be used basically as a steering wheel in reverse gear, essentially. One other extremely helpful control change from the original is how the game utilizes the GameCube's C-Stick. This analog stick gets a lot of hate from many, and I think it is undue, and its utility in Resident Evil alone is proof of what it can do. The C-Stick basically functions as an instant about face. You can flick it in any direction you wish, and your character will perform an exact 180. This means that you don't have to worry about the tyrant getting in a free hit at your initial encounter with him, like you constantly risked with the original. You still have to be quick with your input, but you are far less of a sitting duck this time around than before. It's a huge quality of life improvement. Your other button mapping is predictable. A is your action and select button, Y is your map, X is your inventory, and to raise your weapon, you use the L trigger and fire it with A. I was surprised at how well this control layout worked out, and indeed, in the fuel cell section at the end of the game, this control scheme made it much less of a potential problem, since you have so much leeway with how far you can squeeze the GameCube trigger before your character breaks into a run. I have always been a cheerleader for the GameCube controller's ergonomic molding and layout, and Resident Evil Remake, at least for me with this control scheme, just goes to prove that further. But the HD version, at least on PC, offers a surprisingly entirely different series of control layout options. To be honest, I only played the game with the controller, and really only on one of the modern layouts, so because of my lack of experience with the other control layouts, I hope you can forgive me for not going in depth on all of them, especially since this video is already getting pretty long. This game has two different keyboard and mouse layouts, which have key bindings that are meant to closely replicate two variations in ways people play action games with keyboard and mouse, with the standard WASD shift right mouse button, left mouse button layout, which is basically ubiquitous at this point, as well as a layout which uses the arrow keys and ZXCV. For controllers, the control layouts available are from Type A to Type E. Type A is the one I went for since it is the default modern control layout and the one I felt meshed well with my muscle memory coming from the GameCube version, whilst also providing a control layout that lent the game a modern feel in terms of movement. Movement is tied entirely to the left analog stick, and finally we have a situation where the analog of the stick is actually in use. Your movement speed is also tied to how far you push the stick in any given direction, which means there is no longer a need for a run button. Your movement is now tied to your perspective rather than the character's, meaning that now your character will move in the direction you push the analog stick. There is no more potential left-right confusion. But there is one quirk that comes with this. Because the camera angles change so frequently, that also means that the game runs the risk of mixing up your movement inputs, especially in corners of tight corridors. However, this game solves that issue by preserving the intent of the original movement input direction with the change of camera angles until you cancel that input, after which point it will reset its perspective relative to that of the camera angle. In this way, it kind of reminds me of the first Yakuza game, except a lot more forgiving, since you aren't on an unspoken time limit to change your input in Resident Evil like you are in the original Yakuza. This is also coupled with the fact that if you play on 16:9 mode on PC, the camera angles will pan up or down to make up for the taller resolution of the pre-rendered backgrounds relative to the standard 1920x1080 aspect ratio, giving the game a feel much closer to Yakuza than the original Resident Evil when coupled with this kind of movement input. Your sub-weapons are activated using the left bumper or L1. Aiming your weapons is accomplished with the left trigger or L2, and firing with the right trigger or R2, making the game feel very much to anyone who has ever either played a console first-person shooter or a third-person action game with a controller. Y is your inventory, and the right bumper is your map. Although mechanically different from the button mapping on the GameCube, I didn't have much trouble at all adjusting to this, probably because the general placement of these buttons physically on the Xbox One controller, which is what I personally use to play this game, I found the learning curve for this change to be nearly non-existent. I can't really explain why that was the case, but it just made sense. The control layout even preserves the 180 snap, which works exactly how it did on the C-stick on the GameCube controller, and is mapped to the right analog stick that can again be flicked in any direction to activate. Of course, this is a little redundant in the modern control layout since your character actually turns a lot faster with the left analog stick, and while a little janky to look at, works excessively well at somewhat trivializing some specific encounters, especially bosses. but it's nice to see the right stick flick retained for those who want to use it anyway. There are a number of other controller button mapping layouts in the game, and while they can all be a little bit for modern players to get used to, thanks to the standardized way third-person action games are designed, I think choosing one option that feels the most right and mastering that, rather than seeking out one that is closest to the mapping of modern controls, might be the best way to approach a game of this style. The legacy of its style of design and how it was originally intended to be interacted with just won't work entirely as one might want it to when controls from modern games in the same style are imposed on it. Concessions have to be made somewhere to accommodate the game, so learning controls, whether on PC or GameCube, is essential but very doable. The core of the gameplay for the remake is essentially identical to the original, but just because the core of the original is preserved in the game's design, it does not mean that it's simply the same game with a modern coat of paint. Resident Evil Remake reworks a number of the original game's elements and gameplay that make it its own new experience that stands alone against the original in a way that even the Arranged Mode and ReBirth Mode can't match. Similarly to Arranged Mode, every collectible is shuffled around, but it isn't as simple as simply shifting the positions of key items and ammo. It also transforms the whole game by adding whole new areas to the map. This includes a second floor terrace on one side and an extended outdoor terrace on the other. An additional hallway lined with spears which connects to another room which serves as an alternative path to the dining room from the dining room balcony. An attic area with armor, a library that is only accessible from that armor room, a graveyard behind the mansion, a side trail that leads from the storage shack to a larger cemetery, and eventually a small house which itself leads to an underground area independent of the caves, and a basement area under the mansion in the late game which houses a boss arena and the pathway to the entrance to the laboratory. There are also differences with existing rooms as well. The art room opens up to the graveyard behind the mansion. The costume room is actually hidden behind a painting in the small corridor connected to the blue room on the first floor. The mirror room next door is now a mandatory stop for a key item in the late game, and the bar area in the guardhouse has been greatly expanded, as well as the area where you fight Plant 42 with a wraparound balcony. The way you access rooms has also changed as well. I don't know if it's possible to list them all, but some key ones are the door leading to the East Wing corridor near the safe room, where the door can only be used so many times before the doorknob breaks. There is also the access to the morgue, which now has which door you are meant to enter reversed from the original, and by using the laboratory key. Basically, your sequence that you learned either in the original game or in the Arranged Mode will not help you with this game at all, since the item placement isn't only different, but this game also introduces several more key items you need to progress through the game. But item placement isn't the only thing that changed. Enemy placement has changed as well, and in some interesting ways. Some areas have the same enemies as always, and even the same number of enemies on some occasions, but their placement can vary slightly, and this can sometimes lead to ambushes you weren't expecting, or in some cases, different enemy types appearing in scenes they never did originally. Enemy behavior is largely the same, and even enemy HP remains pretty much the same as on the original versions of the game. That isn't to say that the game doesn't have its own changes to the enemies, however. I failed to mention this in my discussion of the original game simply because the unspoken rules of the original game were so intuitive and clearly explained in the most immersive way possible, it made them easy to overlook. Essentially, enemies in the original behaved according to a series of rules that they never broke unless there was a distinct scripting to a one-off event. Enemies can't follow you downstairs or through doors. Downed enemies can get up, but once downed and blood pools under them, they are dead for good and despawn as soon as you leave through a door. In Resident Evil Remake, these rules are all but disposed of. Zombies can only be permanently taken down under very specific circumstances. Zombies can be permanently taken down by either blowing off their heads, incinerating them with an incendiary round from the grenade launcher, or lighting them on fire after they've been downed using kerosene and a lighter. I'll expand more on that later, but those are the only ways to assure a downed zombie is a dead zombie. Once a zombie is downed, that zombie is basically on a timer, and eventually, if you don't take care of them properly, they transformed into something called a Crimson Head. Crimson Head zombies are stronger, faster, and more aggressive than normal zombies. They take more hits to kill, though once a Crimson Head is taken out, that is a permanently dead zombie. But depending on the difficulty level you're playing on, it might not be worth engaging with these zombies, since they can become bullet sponges. Visually, it can be easy to tell when a downed zombie has transformed into a Crimson Head, since their appearance is very different from the standard zombie. They take on a red tint and have large claws. Sometimes Crimson Heads can actually stay down, and in these cases, it's best to leave them since they are usually only a threat if roused. But when being chased by a zombie or Crimson Head, you still aren't entirely safe if you leave the area through a door. While it depends on the difficulty level, there is a chance that a zombie will break through a door and chase you down. I'm guessing that this is tied largely to RNG, but I'm not entirely sure. While there is exactly one instance in the first game where a zombie is able to open a door at all, it is highly scripted. Here, zombies can break through doors, gates, and even break through windows in the mansion now. There are 2 instances where this window breaking specifically happens, totally stealing the thunder away from the Cerberus. Even hunters now have their time to shine in a window breaking moment in the mid-game. Funnily enough, speaking of hunters aren't as aggressive as they were in the original, and they are much better at giving themselves away in a room in areas where you might suspect one is nearby, but can't see ahead of you because of the camera angle. Hunters, however, much like zombies, can follow you up and down flights of stairs. There is much less in the way of refuge from enemies in the remake, so you must either be prepared to take them out or manipulate their actions in such a way where you can get away from them, both of which are viable even on the higher difficulties. It's a little trickier in the remake to manipulate the behavior of enemies, especially Cerberus, but surprisingly the hunters can be much more easily dealt with despite their higher strength and agility. Bosses, save for one on the merit that they are a new addition to the remake, are largely the same in terms of behavior, though Plant 42 in particular requires some additional steps to deal with. Plant 42 requires you to go up into the balcony and fire your weapon into the bulb of the plant when it opens. You must go up to the balcony for the most clear shot, since now it is far too high up to confidently place your aim. The initial Tyrant fight is also very similar to the original, except for the fact that now the room is more of a U shape instead of a square shape, meaning on top of his slightly increased movement speed, you have a much higher chance of getting yourself cornered if you're not careful. The new boss fight is Lisa Trevor, who was a human child who had a type of virus tested on her, the progenitor virus, I'm pretty sure, which mutated her into the kind of creature you'd be more accustomed to see in a Silent Hill game. This boss cannot be beaten with weapons. She is entirely bulletproof. Instead, you have to open the coffin which houses her dead mother's head. To do this, you must push 4 boulders off a narrow ledge, which can be hazardous, since if you get too close to Lisa Trevor, she can throw you or your partner off the ledge. I had this happen to Wesker during my Chris playthrough, and I found it kind of humorous since he had to survive to the game's ending as the main bad guy. But in any event, this kind of boss fight actually mixes exactly well with the game's survival horror angle, since there really is a stronger emphasis on this boss fight on the puzzle element than the engagement with the enemy, especially since that enemy is unkillable. Puzzles in this game have been entirely revamped, and while they are still in the same nature of the original game, they are still enough of a change that makes a first playthrough feel entirely fresh. From the arrowhead at the beginning of the game to the armor statue puzzle, the V-Jolt chemistry room access code, and the mixing of V-Jolt itself, even how you exit caves under the courtyard are all entirely new. Replacing the gold shield emblem in its spot no longer moves the grandfather clock out of the way, but opens the face, reading the hint on the clock and referring to the large painting to the left of the clock and relating its imagery to the clock face, and then learning which gear turns which hand on the clock face is one of the cool new additions to the game that served as a sure direct inspiration for the DS version's own ReBirth puzzle. Probably the most tense puzzle in the game is the final one involving restoring power to the elevator. This requires you to collect a fuel cell capsule and bring it back to the station where it can be refilled and return it back to the original station so you can go to the large generator and reactivate it. The problem is that the fuel cell, once recharged, is incredibly sensitive to being shaken and jerked around. This means that running is a bad idea, and if you get attacked by a zombie or tick, it very likely means death by explosion. The only way to manage this is to slowly walk with the charged capsule from the recharge station to the first room of the power plant. This is probably the most tense part of the game, since jostling the fuel cell around even a little bit can cause an explosion that will end the game right there. My least favorite puzzle is the second jewelry box, where you must insert the red gem and place all the pieces of the puzzle in the right spots at the top of the box in order to unlock it. While its solution can be relatively easy to come by, getting the pieces to properly fit in place is the biggest challenge, and it feels a bit jank as a result. It's not impossible or anything, but it can be a bit of a time sink if hitting the sub 5 hour or sub 3 hour runtime achievements are a thing you're pursuing. In general, however, the puzzles and the mere act of navigating the mansion is a real treat and serves the game and the aim of reinvigorating the game in a way that the DS ReBirth Mode and even the PS1 Arranged Mode can't, most likely thanks to hardware and development constraints. In terms of gameplay, one of the more surprising changes made in Resident Evil Remake is the balancing between Chris and Jill has been totally reworked. In the original versions of the game, the main difference in gameplay between Chris and Jill were comparatively simple. Jill could pick the locks of some doors and open them, and Chris required an old key to accomplish unlocking the same doors. Jill had access to more weapons, but Chris got more ammo for all his weapons and had a much higher proficiency with the combat knife. Chris is more resilient to damage than Jill and can tank more hits from enemies, and Chris can carry 6 items at a time in his inventory as opposed to Jill, who can carry 8 items in her inventory. All of these things are retained in the remake, but there are some additional aspects to the dynamic between these characters that really changes the way they play, and it is all tied to the lighter and kerosene gameplay mechanic. Downed zombies that haven't been decapitated must be burned if they are to be properly rendered dead. To accomplish this, various areas in and around the mansion contain fuel cans, which contain a limited amount of kerosene. Jill and Chris both gain access to a full canteen, which holds 2 units of kerosene per fill. And taking this along with the lighter are necessary to light up the downed zombies. What makes this interesting is specifically noticed through the inventory screen. If playing as Jill, in the top right-hand corner of the screen, you can see Jill's lockpick has its own special inventory slot. Since this is activated passively, it makes sense that it would exist somewhere on the inventory screen. But when you check Chris's inventory screen, now he has the lighter. This actually accomplishes a couple of things. It makes the lighter, which is a weapon Jill must find in the mansion as she explores it, is in Chris's inventory by default. It also frees up an inventory spot for Chris, which can be incredibly useful, since Jill must have her loadouts built around the canteen and lighter combo to burn zombies. This effectively balances Jill and Chris in an entirely different way than in the original game. What this essentially removes is their differing sequences through the mansion. You basically play through the mansion in pretty much the exact same sequence as both Jill and Chris, since the lockpick isn't really as strongly necessary for progression, and thus not as much of a barrier for access to certain rooms for Chris, which was one of the determining factors for what transformed his sequence in the original game. They are also balanced based on their access to different sub-weapons. Sub-weapons are a new addition to the game, which serve as a means to fight off zombies or other enemies that have successfully grappled your character. Once an enemy grapples you, you have the option to activate your sub-weapon using the left bumper. Whichever weapon is queued in your sub-weapon inventory slot is the next one you will use. Both Jill and Chris have access to the dagger, which will stagger the enemy back off of you. Besides the dagger, Jill also carries a stun gun, which takes 1 whole battery per use. Using the stun gun will result in the enemy being downed, though if it's a zombie, there is still a risk of a crimson head waking after use. Chris gets access to flashbangs, and these are cool to use. Once grappled, Chris will stick the grenade in the enemy's mouth, and once he fires a weapon at the enemy, it blows their head off, killing them permanently. It should be noted, however, that the explosion is hazardous, and the splash damage can also impact Chris if you detonate the grenade too close. The catch with sub-weapons is that they are consumable items, meaning that once they are used, it counts as a unit spent. They exist in a finite amount throughout the game. While you can carry as many of them as you can find on your character, once you run out in your inventory, you will either switch to any other sub-weapon you're carrying, or you're just empty-handed and need to find more to replenish your supply. The balance between Chris and Jill's sub-weapons are interesting in that while the dagger accomplishes the same thing across both characters, the difference really comes down to the stun gun versus the flashbang grenades. The stun gun is successful at downing enemies in one hit, but it only downs enemies sometimes permanently and other times, especially on the higher difficulties, only temporarily, basically acting as a stun, although still dealing significant damage. The grenade is much stronger, as one might expect. Once a grenade is successfully used, that enemy, the zombie in this case, is dead. Not just downed, but dead, and will not respawn and has a 0% chance of coming back as a Crimson Head, and only at the cost of one grenade and one bullet. While these grenades are about as easy to come by as the batteries for Jill's stun gun, at least in my experience, I think that this does a lot to balance out Chris and Jill's loadouts, especially when combined with the restructuring of inventory management around the lighter and the lockpick. One of the things that is also a major highlight in Resident Evil Remake is the dynamic of Chris's and Jill's support characters. This is something present in the original game, but it is even more emphasized in the remake. In the original, Jill and Chris each got a companion character who would help them throughout their story at key areas along the way. While it was functionally identical to the way companion characters worked in the original game, in Resident Evil Remake it becomes much more apparent, and your opportunities for engaging in activities with them are expanded somewhat. For example, Jill might be a bit fragile, but she is much more clever. Barry comes in as her support character to act as her Chris, essentially. Barry has a chance to save her on a number of occasions, especially with the shotgun trap, aka Jill Sandwich. He gives her the grenade launcher, and he can serve as a total boss skip for Plant 42's second stage, if you use the V-Jolt. Barry can also serve as a means to help Jill fight Lisa Trevor and the Tyrant at the end of the game. Especially on the hard difficulty, the latter is incredibly helpful. Chris has a couple of characters that come in and out of his story, but the main one is Rebecca, the same as the original game. Since Chris is more of a tank who can deal high amounts of damage as well as take it, he lacks the finer finesse skills like lockpicking and chemistry. While Rebecca can't pick locks, she can work in the chemistry room, making her a great supplement for Chris for the Plant 42 boss fight, weakening it severely so that Chris can expend less ammo finishing it off. She isn't as much of a tank as Barry, but during the Tyrant fight, she does offer chip damage support and, even more importantly, a means to distract the Tyrant while you can deal DPS damage to it. However, she doesn't help with the Lisa Trevor fight, nor does she drop supplies for Chris like Barry does for Jill. Instead, Chris's support in these cases is from Albert Wesker. Seeing the dynamic between Chris and Wesker is interesting in the remake, but it was surprising to see Wesker there taking shots at Lisa Trevor during the final boss encounter with her. It might seem a bit lopsided that Barry offers more support for Jill, and that might be sort of the case, especially considering that Chris must save Rebecca in the mid-game. Jill also saves Barry, but this is mostly done by choosing the correct answer in a yes or no decision. For Chris, this is a more active engagement. Rebecca is trapped in a room in the mansion with a hunter, and Chris has the opportunity to choose whether or not to go and take out the hunter for her or leave her to die. This also exists in the original game, but this scene can be totally ignored in a Chris playthrough on the PlayStation, Saturn, and DS versions simply by not entering the room where this scene takes place. Because there is no automatic trigger for this scene to take place independently of whether you enter the room or not at that point in the game, it basically never happens, and Rebecca is still there for Chris in the end game. The remake solves this by making it an automatic trigger. As soon as Chris enters the small study to pick up one of the final key items to enter the basement of the mansion to take on Lisa Trevor, the scene triggers, forcing you to act quickly to respond if you want Rebecca to survive. Maybe this isn't as much of a rebalancing between Chris and Jill as what I previously discussed, but it does seem to make a stronger highlight of the supplemental effect that companion characters have in terms of their support they offer to the main characters. They aren't necessary to keep around. Jill and Chris are more than capable of functioning entirely independently, but the companion characters and the support they offer do help to fill in the gaps in the skill sets that the main characters have, and in this case, I found that being emphasized a bit more in the remake, likely thanks to the much more expanded map and the changes in structure from the original. With these things combined, I found that while yes, Chris's more limited inventory is still trickier to navigate on a first-time playthrough as opposed to Jill, the balancing here renders the difficulty between Chris and Jill to be more of a lateral one than a proper higher and lower difficulty. While the original and its ports and revisions typically label Chris and Jill as hard and easy/normal respectively, here they are treated as alternative play styles, relegating difficulty levels to the game's separate difficulty presets instead. This makes sense since it is clear that the game really wants you to play through its story as both Chris and Jill, and given that their progression through the story is beat for beat identical, the learning curve is now dependent on the player's skill at picking and choosing battles and managing inventory, rather than relearning their game sequence from scratch. While each character has their own bespoke story beats and experiences that the other doesn't receive, the mechanical move through the mansion between them is basically identical. Speaking of difficulty levels, Resident Evil Remake has a number of different difficulty settings, which do change the way you interact with the game and its world, sometimes in subtle ways, other times in major ways. Originally, I meant to just play through as Chris and Jill on the normal difficulty and that would be it. But I made a mistake, and this was mostly thanks to the fact that the way the difficulties are titled are a bit poetic, almost cryptic. Somehow, I accidentally finished the game on the easy difficulty as both Chris and Jill on the PC and GameCube version of the game. To make up for this, I actually went back to the PC version and played through again as Jill on the hard difficulty. Somehow I managed to finish that run 3 hours faster than my easy mode run as Chris. Make sense of that how you will, I suppose. Anyway, difficulty on Resident Evil Remake is quite interesting, and these difficulty levels give the player the same kind of incentive to replay the game as the Arranged and ReBirth Mode did in their respective games, if not arguably more so. The standard difficulties are easy, normal, and hard on the GameCube, but there is a very easy mode as well from the get-go on the PC version. These difficulty levels essentially differ in areas involving base HP stats for the enemies, number of enemies, the timer length between when a zombie is downed and when it becomes a crimson head, the success rate of enemies' ability to follow you through doorways, ammo and ink ribbon availability, as well as the availability of healing items. As the difficulty increases, the more scarce items are, and the tougher and stronger enemies get. But upon finishing either normal or hard difficulty, you unlock True Survivor difficulty. This difficulty mode takes the game's base hard mode and unlinks the storage boxes. Throughout the game, originally and on the other difficulty levels, the storage boxes you find throughout the game are all linked, meaning that whatever you put in one storage box in one location will pop up in a storage box in a different location. With True Survivor, they undo this feature, forcing you now to go through the game and plan strategically what should go where in order to minimize backtracking. According to the game, this was an experimental game mode that is now seeing exclusive release in the remake. This is definitely a much more hardcore and arguably immersive mode, since it takes quite a bit of planning to map out where you want to place what and when in your playthrough sequence. Upon finishing the game on the True Survivor mode, you unlock one more mode, which is almost a cruel joke. It's called Invisible Enemies mode, and it is exactly what it is. Luckily, there is an option for mercy with invisible enemies, since this time you can choose which difficulty you want to play through this mode of the game on. So if you want to play through the game with invisible enemies on very easy difficulty, you can do that. Or if you want to play on the hard difficulty, you can do that too, and everything in between. So while yes, it could theoretically be a difficulty level of potentially sadistic proportions, it could also be made a bit less so. But this makes all the enemies invisible, and it includes bosses. It should be noted that playing through either True Survivor mode or Invisible Enemies mode is treated as two completely separate game modes, which means you can't unlink the item boxes in Invisible mode. While I'm not sure why anyone would ever choose to play through the game this way, at the same time, I'm a little surprised that there isn't a way the game allows the player to stack these two game modes for the Dark Souls of Resident Evil level difficulty. One of the things that both of these modes have in common is that they both remove the ability to use limitless ammo weapons like the rocket launcher or the samurai edge, which is a modified Beretta, and that the auto aim is removed, so that means activating your weapon aim does not snap your character in a way that places the closest enemy to them directly in their sights. Instead, aiming must now be performed entirely manually. If it's anything these difficulty options and two alternative gameplay options seem to have in common with the original game, they incentivize frequent replays, and, in fact, seem to be designed around the assumption that the player is so familiar with the game by the time they reach those difficulty levels that they know the game like the back of their hand. In a very similar way to the original Resident Evil, the fun of the game becomes less about the thrill, action, survival, and puzzle solving, and more about figuring out the most optimal route to the end of the game as quickly as possible through repeatedly practicing and memorizing routes, puzzles, and enemy placements. The achievements on the HD remaster kind of lay the groundwork for an eventual Invisible Enemy or True Survivor run, with achievements like finishing the game using only the knife, or without saving, or by finishing the game in less than 5 and 3 hours, respectively. And the fact that fulfilling these challenges can also unlock new collectibles like weapons and costumes, which themselves unlock further achievements, only furthers the fact that this game wants you to come for its story and atmosphere and survival horror gameplay, and stay for the speedrunning and surprisingly deep level of additional player-imposed challenges. Thanks to the fact that the game's core design is built on the foundation of a game that itself excelled at this kind of replayability as part of its core design, it translates excellently here in the remake. Added gameplay modes and areas on the map aren't the only additions made to the remake, however. Resident Evil also includes a lot more story. Thanks to improvements in technology with regard to presentation as well as improvements in localization, Resident Evil Remake ends up delivering a more cinematic experience in its cutscenes, and the dialogue is entirely redone from the original, putting aside the original's B-movie tone in favor of a more dramatic one. The result is a story whose presentation is a worthy inclusion into the world of modern Resident Evil. Scenes from the original game are retained, of course, but scenes like the one in the guardhouse with Barry on the phone with Wesker in one of the rooms in Jill's story from the DX version is also completely redone, with Barry's voice made far more intelligible than it was on the PS1 Arranged Mode. The depictions of characters have also changed along with the dialogue. In the original game, Jill is a capable, independent agent, but does find herself in positions where she either actually or feels like she requires the aid of Barry. Her relationship to Chris, even when he needs saving, feels almost like that of a Tails to Sonic in Sonic Adventure. Jill is to Chris what Tails is to Sonic, except there's a romantic tension between Jill and Chris. This basically means that Chris is almost like someone Jill looks up to in some way, and that there is part of Jill's disposition that makes her feel like she needs a Chris or Barry with her. In the remake, her character is altered to be much more dominant. While yes, the romantic undertones between herself and Chris are still there, Jill has a much more self-sufficient attitude and is generally significantly more confident. She still has her limitations, which manifest in the gameplay, but her personality in the remake seems to match more of her character's legacy and how people know her as in the modern games than the original, adding a stronger connection of her character to the versions of her we see in later games. Rebecca Chambers is also changed completely from the way she was in the first game. Rebecca in the original was almost like a lost girl who happened to get lucky to survive for long enough to eventually run into Chris. Chris talks to her like she's a little girl, and she seems to be perfectly receptive to it, despite being an elite member of STAR's Bravo team. In any event, her character sees a pretty drastic change, probably due to the fact that this version of her had just experienced the events of Resident Evil 0, which was a prequel game to be released after the Resident Evil remake, which renders her original portrayal unrealistic in the series canon. Still, with her limitations regarding her position as a medic and engineer, leaving her with very little self-defense armament, she makes up for it in being hyper-competent in pharmaceutical and engineering tasks, which makes her an invaluable companion to Chris, who knows nothing about any of those things. There's also additional lore that wasn't included in the original game that helps to flesh out the scale of the world and the history of how this outbreak even began. The Trevor family story is added here to help give an idea of just how long research for biochemical weapons had been going on at the mansion and how that affected the Trevor family, especially Lisa Trevor. Lisa Trevor is an unkillable foe in Resident Evil Remake, and you can pick up small pieces of information in the form of journal entries and other environmental hints that paint her tragic and grim story. Her inclusion adds to the series' lore in a significant way, and it helps to make sense of the legend of the seemingly immortal Albert Wesker. The history and the number of people involved are fascinating. Of course, we already knew about John Clemens and Ada Wong from the original game, Albert Wesker's involvement in the development of the Tyrant, and why so many people became zombies, but the remake introduces a deepening conspiracy involving Lord Spencer and William Birkin, their planned execution of the Trevor family in order to eliminate any information about the Spencer Mansion's layout being leaked to the public. The continual tests on Lisa Trevor when it was accidentally discovered that she was genetically immune to the progenitor virus, how the G virus was developed, etc. Of course, these were all explanations for plot points that didn't yet exist in the original game, but to tie in the new areas and new gameplay mechanics and story in with these retroactively added story elements in a way helps to expand the mysterious nature of the mansion rather than demystifying it, since thanks to these new environments, it allows the player's imagination to run wild about what the halls of this mansion must have seen at the height of its operations, something you really only got occasional glimpses of through some of the discoverable documents found around the mansion in the original game. Thanks to the additional discoverable texts and the additional puzzles which require referring to them, I found that the story in the remake was a welcome one in helping to further flesh out the history of the series and fill in the gaps of the story which were inadvertently created by successive games as their stories became increasingly complex. Well, I think that's about everything. After so many playthroughs and this being practically the only game I've played since the beginning of April, playing through both Jill and Chris's stories over the course of the different versions of the game, I feel like I've come to appreciate a game that was already one of my all-time favorites before I even started this project. It really is impossible to pass a qualitative judgment as to whether one version of the game is truly definitive over any other. Despite just finishing heaping tons of praise on Resident Evil Remake, I don't think such a great game could be made if the foundation of the original wasn't already there. What really is amazing is that every version of this game, be it the original, the Saturn port, the director's cut, the remake, the DS enhanced port of the original, or the HD remaster of the remake, they all offer surprisingly different experiences that help vary the gameplay of the game's foundational elements in such a way that I don't think we've really managed to see in the other games in the series. I'm not saying that this is the best game in the series, but I can't help but to get the impression that this seemingly infinite transformability of the base game is probably symptomatic of a game that is at its core extremely tightly designed. It's impressive that a game like this could weather the test of time so well as to have its original ported to modern systems as recently as the mid-2020s, while also having the remastered remake universally available on nearly everything since the 7th generation console era and survive virtually unchanged from its original release. This is obviously subjective, but is this not a sign of something that is potentially among the best games ever made? Each version of the game offers its own twist on the gameplay, be it a major transformation of the core game itself or as a small side game that is unique to its own specific platform. Regardless, however, they still maintain a continuous thread in spirit to one another, and it's in this way that they are all the same. They all share an emphasis on survival horror, but they are all equally designed to keep playing. To try new things, challenge yourself with new gameplay styles, treating the game like a time trial, doing minimal weapon runs, etc. For a dedicated player who values getting the absolute most out of every game they play, Resident Evil 2 is a class act in literally all its forms. It's a 2-hour game masquerading as an 8-hour game masquerading as a 2-hour game that can be played in 50 times in every one of its forms, and that is each version's common thread that ties them all together. The spirit of Resident Evil is to be applauded, and its developers ought to be celebrated for bothering to add so much to a game that everyone was potentially already happy with the 1996 original. It shows a dedication to the craft of game design, and the levels of creativity present here is the element I think makes all these games enjoyed by players over 30 years later. So my advice, 30 years later, keep playing it, because when you do, you're retro-maxing.